as well as in federal and state government. At CPRA, he has served as the Deputy Executive Director, Division Chief of Planning and Research, and as lead author of Louisiana's Comprehensive Master Plan for a Sustainable. Mr. Hass, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Is the audio okay? Good. Looks like folks can hear me. Well, I appreciate it. Well, I want to talk with you a little bit today about Louisiana's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and our master plan for sustainable coastal Louisiana. That master plan has been called a lot of things, a climate adaptation plan in part, coastal resilience plan, and I think it certainly fits with the theme of the day, and so certainly want to share with you where we are, some of the things that we've done, and sort of where we're headed with that. So we're a relatively new state agency. We've been in existence for about 15 years or so. It really came about in the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. So we were officially formed in about the 2007 time period. But at that point in time, I think it was leadership within the state understood that we weren't conducting our business in a way that was proper, quite frankly. We had one entity doing coastal restoration along our coast, another entity dealing with risk reduction along our coast. The two rarely spoke, if or coordinated in any way whatsoever. And certainly Katrina and Rita really was that. Those things needed to be integrated. They rely on each other. And for us to be successful in doing what we needed to do along our coast, there needed to be a comprehensive vision to integrate those two things and move forward. And so that was really the genesis of CPRA. We were tasked with developing a master plan for sustainable coasts, and I'll talk with you a good bit about that today. So I did want to talk a little bit about kind of what we're doing, though. So I'm going to talk real high level, master plan level, but I also want you to know that there's lots of good work that's going on the ground. And so what you see here, a bunch of numbers I know, and they might not mean a lot to you, but if you're interested in knowing about what we're doing today, I'd encourage you to go to our website and take a look at our annual plan. So each year we lay out, we tier off of that master plan that I'm going to talk with you about, and we lay out what we anticipate to do in the upcoming fiscal year. This year, we anticipate expending about almost $1.4 billion on 142 projects, and you can see the other numbers there. In the interest of time, I'll not list all those, but that will have a tremendous impact both on reducing risk to our coastal communities, in addition to creating land along our coast. Similar suite of numbers you see here. This is really since our inception in 2007. You see over 50,000 acres of our coastal wetlands have been benefited. 165 million cubic yards of sediment have been dredged to recreate wetlands, build barrier islands, build ridges and so forth along our coast. And then you can see the numbers for miles of levees and barrier islands as well. And just to give you a little bit of a visual, literally over 100 projects have been completed in that time frame. They stretch from Holly Beach to Hopedale across our coast. Again, all of this information can be found if you want to dig into it a little bit more at our website, coastal.la.gov. So I kind of teased the master plan and then went away from it a little bit. I do want to kind of get into some of the details here and let you know really what this master plan is all about. So I got several bullets on the slide here, but honestly, when I think about Louisiana's coastal master plan, it really boils down to two primary things. It's a way for us to make very hard decisions about how to expend limited resources for our coast to do the most good for the most people along our coast. And then once that process is undertaken, and I'll go through that a bit in a little more detail, it's a list of projects. It's a list of those priorities that we think we need to implement for our coast so that we can have as sustainable a future as possible. And so that really covers sort of that first bullet there, but it's built on world-class science and engineering. It illustrates how the coast is going to change, very importantly. I think a lot of folks understand that our coast is changing, but don't have necessarily a real good idea of what the future might look like. The master plan helps us to envision that. We do update it every 6 years so that we can incorporate new advances in technology, new science. Previously, we've updated the plan every 5 years. That recently has changed, and the next update will be coming out really right now. We're in the midst of the development or the final stages of development of the 2023 master plan that will be officially released next year. So it does incorporate not just that science and engineering. There's extensive public review and public input that's involved as well. I mentioned the integrated approach to risk reduction and restoration, and the identification of those priorities that will not only pay off sort of in the here and now, but also in the future for our children and grandchildren. So just to give you an idea of the context of sort of where the master plan fits in the evolution of a project or our program, it's really the high level kind of broad view, again, of our coast. From that, we tear off of the master plan with the annual plan and develop individual projects through feasibility, engineering, design, construction, and then of course we monitor and adaptively manage those projects. All of that, there's a feedback loop, of course, that goes into not just the next master plan development, but as we're developing the feasibility level analysis for projects, engineering and design and construction, that feedback from the monitoring and operations and maintenance is provided for those activities as well. There are 5 real objectives associated with the master plan. You see those here. Of course, we want to protect our citizens from flooding, hurricane storm surges primarily. We want to harness the natural processes that built coastal Louisiana in the first place and use those to our best advantage so that we're not relying so heavily on diesel, quite frankly, fuel and mechanical restoration of projects. We want to rebuild those coastal habitats that are so important, not just to the animals, the fish and wildlife that live along our coast, but the communities that rely on those. That's tied very closely with maintaining our cultural heritage in coastal Louisiana. Louisiana is also a unique place in that our coast is very much a working coast, and we want to provide that for future generations as well. So this is sort of the very boiled down process by which the master plan is developed. And it really starts with a suite of projects, and those projects are developed through ideas that we at CUPRA have. We have a public solicitation period. We actually had 2 for this 2023 master plan. And we developed work groups of stakeholders and interested parties around the coast to help develop projects that can then be evaluated through a suite of predictive models. The output of those models is then organized and sort of evaluated through a planning tool. Ultimately, that we develop alternatives of those projects and a plan and a master plan that you see that was developed in 2017. And again, as I said, we're updating that and will be released in 2023. So we began with that suite of projects, and I really already touched on that. So next time I'll move forward, but this was the result of this year's sort of solicitation and project development process. Number of projects, wide variety of types of projects you see again across the coast, from the west coast of Louisiana all the way to the east coast of Louisiana. Many different project types: living shorelines, marsh creation, different kinds of risk reduction projects, both structural risk reduction, levees, flood walls, and that kind of thing, and non-structural risk reduction are things like home elevations, buyouts, and those kind of things. But you can see a large suite of projects that is being evaluated really as we speak for the 2023 plan update. So those projects that are developed with some sort of basic information are then evaluated through a suite of predictive models, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So there are really 3 main categories, 3 sets, if you will, of models that we use. So we use a landscape model. It's called the ICM, or the integrated compartment model. That suite of models really evaluates projects in terms of how much land can they build, or what impact do they have on a more accurate way to how much land is maintained is a piece of that. But they look at things like hydrology, wetland geomorphology, vegetation types, HSIs for various organisms, and so forth. The second one that is used is the surge and wave modeling. This is the altered landscapes really feed into that. Of course, the amount of wetlands that we have along our coast and the morphology of those wetlands really impact the way storm surges affect our communities. So as a storm is approaching our coast, if it's got a barrier island, a ridge, or a large expanse of marsh in front of it, it can impact storm surges propagating sort of up basin and up along our coast versus an area perhaps that wouldn't have that. So we do evaluate how projects affect those things, and then that all translates into risk. So storm surge is important to know about, and it's key, but the reason we really care about it is because it affects things that that cost money, right? It affects our homes, it affects our businesses, it affects our infrastructure. And so the risk model takes the storm surge information and translates that into expected annual damages along our coast. So as I mentioned, the outputs then of those models, the projects that are modeled are then prioritized into what are really the most effective and can do the most good along our coast. And so just to get into that a little bit, this is some of the planning tool output and some of the planning tool sort of organizational features that you see here. So projects ultimately are selected on two sort of major metrics. One, how much do they build or maintain land? Again, our landscape is extremely important to us for lots of reasons that we just talked about. And then two, how much can they reduce risk? How much expected annual damages can be reduced? And then we also have expected average structure damage, which is a new thing this year, which is agnostic really to property value. And so I can touch on that in just a few moments. But these are used, and then there are also other metrics that are used besides those two primary to sort of test how suites of projects that we put together and ultimately our plan can impact things like socially vulnerable communities, fishing communities, navigation, for example, and things of that nature. And so that really serves as sort of the additional lens through which we can look at our plans to determine how it might impact some of those things that are very important to our coast. We do as well evaluate projects across a range of potential future environments. So if hurricanes are more intense and more frequent, which people think they will be, that is included into a future environmental scenario. The sea level rise accelerates, for example. Evapotranspiration is greater or less. Rainfall is greater or less. Those things are factored into environmental scenarios in the future so that we can evaluate those projects across a wide range of potential futures and select projects that are robust against perhaps a high rate of land loss and a low rate of land loss, for example. And so it's really a way for us to sort of hedge our bets. There are two ways we can do that. One is to, again, evaluate projects that are robust across varied futures of our coast. But also we're updating the plan every 5 or 6 years now, right? So as we learn more about what's happening with our climate, as we learn more about what's happening with our coastal landscapes, as we learn more about the success of many of our projects, or if they're not working for that matter, that information can be fed back in to the next round of evaluation as one of those feedback loops that I was just talking about. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really about more than just selecting kind of the suite of projects. It's also about sort of illustrating how those projects affect our coast and how our coastal communities and how they may really experience that change. So I've talked a little bit about the metrics already and how our projects might impact agricultural communities, for example, perhaps navigation, fishing communities, and things of that nature. But one of the things that's new this year that we're also doing an additional analysis to help us illustrate how communities are experiencing things like high water. So we've got a real problem in coastal Louisiana. If anybody that's spent any time along our coast or perhaps is from a coastal community knows that, where it used to be kind of an unusual event for our roads to flood, perhaps to have water in your yard and so forth, that's not so much the case anymore. Many communities are experiencing, of course, what's known as sunny day flooding or southerly wind type flooding. And that can have a real impact on our communities. That may not be catastrophic, but it can have real impacts. And so one of the things we're looking at three is what sort of impacts that actually has on folks. One example of that would be access to healthcare. So if your road's flooded and you can't drive to your doctor, you can't drive to the hospital, what sort of an impact and how do we quantify that impact on communities? But that's something that's being undertaken in the 2023 update. So a few of the things I'll leave you with, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'll wrap it up. But we're talking about resilience, right? And coastal resilience here. I've talked about the master plan as being a bit of a resilience plan, a coastal resilience. So that the process produces predictions of risk and projections of what our future landscape might look like and habitat change over 50 years, among other things. But what's the, if you're not necessarily interested in just coastal restoration for ecosystem's sake, for example, or for a particular community in an area, for example, what does that really mean to you? Well, the governor has set up an adaptive governance initiative to really focus on translating the outputs of coastal master plan to other parts of state government. And as I said, I may not have said this, but one of the key pieces of our coastal master plan is to be transparent and honest about what our potential futures might be along our coast, so that individuals can make wise and informed decisions about things like where they invest, where they might want to live, where they might want to start a business or relocate a business for that matter. But the same holds true for government, right? And so the real intent is that while this is CPRA's coastal master plan, it's the state's plan, and it's our entire, anybody who's interested in anything that's going on in this, their plan. So again, the push behind the governor's adaptive governance initiative is really to focus on facilitating the use of the information that's produced by the master plan to other state agencies so that they can make wise, informed decisions about investments for the future. If you're DOTD, is it wise to retop a road, perhaps in a community that whose future is uncertain? Where's the best place to place a hospital, for example, if DHH is considering the changes along our coast? And so that's something we're really excited about, something the governor has really pushed, and we're excited that that we're involved and can help provide some information related to that. So I'll wrap it up here. Again, I've mentioned a few times, but there's literally thousands of pages of technical documents, not so technical documents, whatever you may be interested in, available at our website. So if anything I mentioned to you piqued your interest, I'd certainly encourage you to visit coastal.gov, go to the master plan website, and you can dive in just as deep as you want. And so with that, I thank everybody for your time and your attention. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to take some if. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Haas. Our next speaker is Dr. Christopher Delia. He's been the Dean of the College of Coast and Environment at LSU since 2009. Before that, he held faculty and administrative positions at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, the University at Albany, SUNY, and the University System of Maryland. He's a graduate of Middlebury College and the University of Georgia. He's been active in nonprofits, the Coastal and Estuarian Research Federation, Association of the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography, the Council for Scientific Society of Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography, and the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, and SURA. His research interests include nutrient dynamics in aquatic systems, estuarian ecology, coral reef ecology, algal invertebrate symbiosis, science, history and policy, math and science education, marine pollution, global climate change, energy, and analytical chemistry. And Dr. Delia's wife, Jennifer, is a retired fundraising executive. Dr. Delia, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Amal. I happen to teach a class in energy and environment, so this is an ideal opportunity for me to talk to you about some of the topics that we consider in there. And in fact, Amal's been a visiting lecturer in that class and talked about EVs. So this is something that she's really a specialist in. I just wanted to follow up on what Bren said. I think the state of Louisiana gets a bad rap for a lot of things, healthcare, education, so on and so forth. But our master plan is the best in the whole country, bar none. And Bren has had a huge hand in making it that way, because before he became director of CPRA, he had a major role in making and shaping the master plan. So we owe him a debt of gratitude as citizens of this state. Today, I want to talk to you about the transition to electric cars. I see I have they want to reboot, which I call the transition to electric cars to address the future to address future climate change, rough road ahead. And I say it this way, not to be critical, but to emphasize how challenging this is going to be. It's going to be enormously challenging. I think you'll find out as I go through my talk with some of the reasons why. Next slide. I can do it. So very recently, this is a headline from the Washington Post. The Ipcc 6 assessment report came out, and it is basically making very dire predictions about the future of humanity and the climate change issue. Now, I know Jay and I could probably argue for hours on this topic, but I do think there's some real concern here, and I think we need to, as part of the precautionary principle alone, do everything we can to try to mitigate the problem. The issue is not everything we do is really going to help that much, and it is very difficult to determine how to be most effective in meeting the requirements of solving the problem. So why is it not going? Next one, could you do it for me? Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the Ipcc 6 assessment. What I have is circled in red. The bottom line is, according to the assessment, limiting warming to less than 2 degrees C will be very difficult to achieve. And they show in the red, I've outlined what they show, and that top bar is sort of the business as usual scenario. If we do everything we're doing now, that's where we're headed. And 2 degrees C is going to have real severe effects on a lot of things. So it's not something that we desire to happen at all. So we want to be much lower than that in terms of the change. Next slide. Now, one of the major ways of controlling greenhouse gases is to look at the transportation, and that's the 36% of the greenhouse gas emissions in this country. A lot of it is fossil fuel, and I'll show you that in a second. For Louisiana, we're a little bit different, and that's because we have such a huge industry, chemical industry. So the emissions are not proportionally the same in the U.S. and the state is singled out as, I think, unfairly on the basis of that, because we perform very vital services in terms of the oil and gas industry for the rest of the country. Next slide. So if you look at the mix of fuels that are available for our transportation, you'll see that the gasoline is still very dominant. And we have jet fuel, natural gas, distillates, petroleum distillates, and a very small amount of biofuels. And I can go on and on for hours about biofuels. I did research on that topic years ago myself, and it's in itself a very challenging area. But we are very much wedded to oil and gas for our transportation needs. And that is a huge concern if we don't have oil and gas in the future, which is what a lot of people want to have happen. Next slide. So President Biden had a vision, and it basically is this. With the CEOs of the big 3 automakers, the head of the UAW made an announcement not very long ago, in August of last year, that putting electric vehicles will be at the heart of what the U.S. is going to do. And his goal is to have 50% of new car sales by 2030 as electric vehicles. Now, that sounds like a big goal, and it is, but I want to delve into it a little bit more and show you why it is a challenge. Go back one, please. So according to E&E News, and their comments about this bold plan, yet the target has no penalty for non-compliance. Statements from industry, including some companies that were part of the White House's own release, made clear that their buy-in was conditioned on the emergence of new policies, even as Congress's willingness to fund new support for EVs remains in doubt. And so that is a political lift that's going to be very difficult for the president. He needs to get buy-in to make this happen. And one person commented, and it was funny, I picked up on this because my thinking was going in this direction as I was putting this together. What this feels like to me is JFK's moon shot, said auto researcher Carl Brower. There was no binding requirement. Nobody was going to get in trouble if the US didn't get to the moon by the end of the decade, but we did get there. There was an aspirational desire to get there. And I think that's going to be the key here. If we get to where we have 50% EVs, there'll have to be an aspirational desire. Next slide. So here's JFK's vision. He said, I believe that this nation commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. And he said this in front of a joint session of Congress. And in fact, 8 years, 1 month, and 25 days later, in July of 1969, he accomplished that goal, even though he wasn't alive to see it actually happen. And it's a very impressive achievement for any president. And I would say this: he had a focused vision and a clear goal. He established milestones along the way, Mercury, Gemini, et cetera. He made his challenge public. He led vigorously and had strong political support from both sides of the aisle. He chose great managers to make it happen. He got public buy-in, and the political will was there to make it happen. And that is a big challenge of the present administration in terms of a lot of things. I will say, from CPR's point of view as well, there are a lot of similar challenges. You're putting together an incredibly complex mix of things in which not everybody agrees with it. So you're just talking about diversions, for example, you'll get 6 different opinions from 6 different people in southern Louisiana. Next slide. So some pertinent quotes about vision that I think are very interesting, because this illustrates how well JFK rose to the challenge. Vision without execution is hallucination, said Thomas Alva Edison. A vision without a plan is just a hallucination, said Will Rogers. The best vision is insight, said Malcolm Forbes. So clearly vision and the ability to convert that vision into reality is a big thing. Now, JFK clearly realized these things, and he set up the conditions to realize his vision. The question is, can the Biden administration match that? And if this transition is successful, how much will it actually do to reduce GHGs, greenhouse gases? And what are some of the unanticipated effects that we could see as we make this transition? Next slide. So if 50% of new car sales by 2030 will be electric vehicles, what does that mean? Well, we have about 275 million light duty vehicles in this country. Approximately 12 to 15 million cars reach the end of their use each year. It's a turnover about 5% roughly every year. We now produce about 10 million new vehicles every year. So that means if the 50% goal is reached, that'll be 5 million EVs a year, which is not even 2% of the entire fleet per year. So that is not a huge impact right away in terms of even if we're successful in getting to that ambitious goal of 5 million. Now, there is good news about EVs. While conventional vehicles today last an average of 12 years or 200,000 miles, EVs should last at least 300,000 and maybe more. And on top of that, although they're more expensive to buy, they're cheaper to operate. Next slide. So the nomenclature of EVs is very simple. The 3 basic categories: hybrid vehicles, hybrid electric vehicles, which many of you have, Toyota Prius being an example; plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which unlike the hybrid electric, which are gas powered and they convert the gas to electricity for driving the drivetrain, plug-ins actually can be plugged in, or they can also use conventional fuel, usually gasoline. And then the last category is all electric vehicles. Now, the last category is very good in a lot of ways. It'll be lighter and cheaper and all that sort of stuff, but there'll be problems associated with it. So let's go through some of those issues. Next slide. The first one is charging. You have to know a little bit about how EVs and PHEVs are charged. Level 1 charging is what you do at home. You just plug it into your standard 120 volts, and you can get about 2 to 5 miles of range per hour of charging. Pretty darn slow. The level 2 is 240 volts, and it's faster, and you can get a better charge that way. Level 3 is still not defined, but they're going to work towards that one. DC fast is 480 volts, and that allows 60 to 80 miles of range and in 20 minutes of charging. And then they're also developing a wireless as well. Even under the best circumstances with the DC fast, the charging problem is there. It takes a long time to charge an EV. Next slide. Now, I know this from experience because I like to do crazy things like testing new technology out. So my wife's chagrin, I decided to get a PHEV some years ago and see how it worked. I was lucky. I got an off-year model. It was the previous year's model, and I got a good discount on it. So it was just about like buying a normal new vehicle would be. But there was a premium for the PHEV categorized. And here it is, charging at home. And I'm pretty successful in charging it every night when I get home. And then the next day, I'm basically driving 6 miles from my house to LSU and back. And that's easily within the range of this car. So I'm very comfortable with that. It's largely a commuter vehicle. Next slide. Now, let me go through this in some detail. There are wonderful pros associated with it. Potentially lower greenhouse gas emissions and also lower pollutants like NOx and SOx and all that stuff in places like Baton Rouge. Service life can be double that of a conventional gas-powered vehicle. Electric motors are extremely lightweight, very efficient and reliable. They may achieve up to 90% efficiency under some circumstances. That's really great. They can be fueled by electricity from renewable sources. So it's not inconceivable that you can have a solar panel up at your parking place at work and plug your car in and you get renewable energy that way. Maintenance is less expensive. Technological advances will ultimately increase battery life, which is going to be really important because they're limited right now. Batteries are very expensive. And if you want the high-end Tesla kind of vehicle, you have to pay a premium to get the kind of range they offer. But there are a lot of cons. The greenhouse gas emission issue, it depends on the primary energy source. Electricity has to come from somewhere. If it comes from a coal-fired plant, then that's not giving you any advantage at all. If it comes from nuclear, where a lot of our energy here in this area comes from, that's probably pretty good. And certainly if it comes from a renewable source, that would be even better. Battery storage is not nearly as energy dense as you would find in a liquid fuel. You have the battery matrix, which in itself is heavy. So the ratio of the battery weight to the actual fuel you have is like 1/50th of the efficiency of weight that you're taking that you have when you have a gas tank full of gas. So that's a real issue. As I said, it's slower, obviously. It requires some very difficult to obtain rare earth and other costly metals. As I said, more expensive to produce and to buy. When the batteries run out, and they only last about maybe 8,000, no, more than that. They'll last 8 years or so, I think what it is. They have to be replaced and they're expensive. They don't work well in cold climates. If you live in Alaska, you don't want an electric. It's not going to be very good because they're not very efficient. You have to dispose of the batteries when they're gone, and that's a difficult proposition. EVs running out of charge. Think about this: you run out of charge in your EV on the causeway at I-10, and you don't have a truck pull up to you and just dump a tank of gas into your car and then you drive off. You've got to have some way of either towing the vehicle or plugging it into a fast charger. So I see that as a really big issue, and nobody talks about it. And then probably the biggest problem we have is our electric grid and our generating capacity are just not sufficient to the task. And that's something that is really being looked at with reckless abandon in DC. Next slide. So air conditioning affects range. This is an interesting one. Without air conditioning, my car, this is actually a picture from my car, and notice the total average miles per gallon is 225 roughly, which is just pretty impressive. But I lose 3 miles of range if I want to turn the air conditioner. So if you're an idiot like me and you want to get your maximum advantage out of your electric, you keep your air conditioner off and you arrive at work soaked. But if you heat in this particular car, it's a resistance heat, and that's even worse. So that means in the winter, you're going to really be cold by the time you get to work if you're in any northern climate at all. Next slide. Well, just another recent article is a Rivian CEO warns of looming electrical vehicle battery shortage. He cites supply chain issues and ultimately shortages of things like rare earth metals, et cetera, are going to be really serious predicaments for us to overcome. Next slide. Now, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last fall does try to address some of these issues, like the infrastructure issue. And I don't know about if our state officials are here are aware of what the governor's been up to in this. He's been very aggressive in trying to develop a system of improved infrastructure for charging electric vehicles and other alternative fuel vehicles along our highways. And so there's an elaborate process, and the bottom line is they have to have a plan together in the state to go to the feds by August 1st this summer to say what they want to do, and then they get a bundle of money to start implementing it. Next slide. Now, I would emphasize that there are other choices besides electric vehicles to reduce fuel use, and that's important. And so I would encourage the Biden administration not to just dump all their eggs in pushing EVs, to think about these other things as well, which they are thinking about in the Department of Energy. Various kinds of fuel economy enhancement. I'll talk about that in a second. Alternative fuel vehicles, hybrid vehicles, idle reduction. Just having your car turn off when you get to a stoplight is a major savings of energy and reduces GHGs. Reduction of mile travels, so more virtual meetings, et cetera. And then obviously mass transportation has the potential effect to help out as well. Next. Well, there are now the Federal Highway Association Administration has alternative vehicle fuel corridors around the country. And you can't see, but most of the corridors that are on this are the interstates, and the green areas are where we actually have some implementation. So most of these things have a long way to go before we actually have charging stations, et cetera, on our highways. Next slide. In Louisiana, here's down the lower right panel is a picture of the governor, the transportation secretary, and showing what Louisiana is doing in terms of implementing our version of the FHWA alternative fuel corridors. And so there's a lot of attention being paid to this, and I applaud it. Next slide. Now, emissions and petroleum reductions have been significant from all these efforts with time. And so this slide, I'll make the slides available because I know this is probably the worst presentation room in the whole university for actually seeing what the speaker is showing on the board here. But I'll make this available. The bottom line is that this complex mix of tools that we have can really save us a lot of greenhouse gas and fuel. Next slide. So if you look at the various activities that we have that reduce these emissions, you can see, for example, that idle reduction, which is a light blue patch on the left, is one of the most significant ways of saving GHGs. And this can be done on a conventional gas-powered vehicle quite easily. So it's very worthwhile. And the technology is there. It's just making your car into a giant golf cart, which works great. and so on. So there are wonderful potentials in a variety of ways to reduce the amount of fuel used and greenhouse gas. Next slide. Now, we have seen substantial increases in our miles per gallon fuel efficiency over the years. If you go back to the 70s, go back to 1975, our vehicles were getting less than 15 miles a gallon. And now the average car is getting over 30. And it's going to go even higher in the future because they just came up with a new number, which is 49, I believe. I think it's on the next slide. Anyway, we've made real progress in increasing. Oh, there it is. It says 49 miles per gallon by 2026. That's another very recent headline. And this is going to have a major and good effect as well. But the collateral thing is it's going to make cars more expensive. And the automakers squawk a lot because they're saying you're putting cars out of the affordability category for many people. And that is an equity issue that we have to deal with. Next slide. Now, a lot of people think that somehow what the US does is going to control the whole system, globally speaking. And unfortunately, that's not the case. If you look at the emissions, fossil CO2 emissions and projections, you see that China has been on a very steep curve in terms of its emissions with time. And the crossover point occurred back around 2005 or 6, where the emissions by China exceeded our emissions in the US. Now, China is a more populous country. There are 3.2 billion people there in China, as I recall. No, what is it? No, it's 1.3 billion people in China versus us of about 330 million. So on a per capita basis, they're in a better shape than we are. So let's look at the projections for global auto growth. Everybody in a developing country wants to live at the standard that the US and the Western societies live in. And so a lot of the projected growth is going to come in China and other nations that are trying to develop their standard of living. And you'll notice at the bottom, you see the USA, it's the lowest of the lines. We're projected to be pretty steady. So again, what we do in the US is not going to solve the problem. It'll contribute to some extent. But to people that think that we're the key to it all, I got bad news for them. What's going on in China is going to be a lot more impactful. India is growing fast now as well. Indonesia is following, and other developing countries. Next slide. So I'm actually going to make this on time. A transition to electric vehicles will be challenging for a whole bunch of reasons, and I could have gone into a lot more in depth with you. It's worth doing. I don't want to say we shouldn't be doing it, but I think it's going to be very challenging, and it's going to take a lot of political will that I don't know if it's there or not. Clearly, EVs can help, but they're just one tool in the toolkit that we can use. Even if we achieve the ambitious goal of 50% of new vehicles in 2030 being EVs, we still have a long way to go to reach zero carbon emissions in this country. So that is something that we've got to understand. And then, as I just emphasized in the previous slide, the US alone cannot solve the GHG problem. China, India, and other Asian nations will play a particularly large role in achieving the COP26 goals. And with that, next slide. I want to acknowledge Tyler Herman of the Clean Cities Coalition Network, who gave me a couple of the great slides that I was able to put in this, and to say thank you, and I'd love to take your questions. Environmental benefits The answer is yes. I'm not intimately familiar with the literature on that, but there's fairly substantial literature that does exist on what they call life cycle analysis. The EPA and the Department of Energy are both big proponents of life cycle analysis. And that, in effect, is the big challenge of all of these energy schemes that we come up with. If you take just one part of it, it looks great, but when you put it all together in a systematic way and you use truly critical thinking, then you find things are not what you'd hoped. So for example, and there's a concept I teach in my course called energy return on investment, which is the equivalent of how much energy you have to invest in something to get energy out. And ideally, you want a high ratio. You want to have more energy coming out than you put in, because that's a sort of analogous to return on investment. You get a high ratio and you have a profit. And there are a lot of things, I mentioned biofuels, which are dismally low for EROI. They may be at best 2.0, which you get twice the energy out for the energy you have to invest to get that energy. You're never going to power society on that basis. This won't work. We estimate that you need at least 7 to 1 EROI to be successful. So similarly, the question you asked is exactly on target. How do you put this all together and you look at the collateral environmental effects and come up with the right answer? We have a wonderful donor, Freeport-McMoRan, who supports scholarships. Now, there's some people in my college said we shouldn't be accepting the money because they're a mining company and they pollute. Well, the fact is, we'll never achieve electric vehicles without mining companies around to get the nickel and the other things that we need out of the ground. So, you know, you could say we're being hypocritical by accepting their money, but if we don't have that company, what's the alternative? And I think that we're having a lot of arguments in the public arena that tend to reduce things to stupid taglines and base political arguments, when really it's going to require the kind of deep thinking that you're talking about. Yes.
I have a question. So you touched upon the infrastructure bill in order to increase the vintage of fixation. How about are we going to take it a step further from this?
Well, these are good questions. It's a very complex topic. If you know about how the highways are funded, they're funded by taxes on gasoline sales. And so if we go to electric vehicles entirely and we cut out gasoline, then how are we going to fund the construction and maintenance of highways? And then there are other things that they're huge petroleum hogs, if you will. The tires you put on your car, they come from things you get out of the ground. So I don't know what the alternative to a tire is going to be in the future. And these are all the kinds of complex issues that have to be thought about. And I will say this, that in my view, the hard left in our country is not thinking very carefully about the ramifications of what they advocate, because it is complex. And you know, my view is that every individual at LSU should take my course, not because I'm such a good professor, but because the topic is so bloody important for all of our future. I mean, you talk about the stuff that our colleagues in the state government do, like Bren. We have to invest a lot of energy in that. We have to put concrete in, and that itself is 5% of the world's CO2 emissions come from concrete. These are really complex issues, and you've got to put it all together. Yes. Yeah, I don't know much detail about that act, so I'm not the right one to talk about it. Maybe Amol has more knowledge about that than I do. But Let me just say there are safety considerations that one needs to worry about. Lithium batteries can be dangerous and they can explode. And in the case of a collision, they can explode. I have personal knowledge of this. I lost my son to an explosion of a vape pen that was the battery that blew up. So it's a very serious consideration, and we need to think about that sort of. As to the funding of mass transportation and other things in the bill, I really can't answer that. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, like the chart about the different years. Right now, with the crisis, the inflation rate that's going up.
Well, yeah, the affordability is going to be a huge issue. More and more in the future, the individual personal vehicle is going to be a luxury item. And only the wealthy will be able to have them, especially if we continue to suffer from the inflation rate we now have. No doubt about it. I'm always amazed that people from California brag about all the Teslas they have. I mean, how many people have 80 grand they're going to sink into an automobile? My golly, it's a lot. Any other questions? Yes.
Like if they decrease these like attention.
There is. The trouble is that most of the alternative fuels are not fairly huge in terms of their energy capacity. And that's the issue that we really face, is we're very lucky that Mother Nature has given us petroleum. That is the result of millions of years of chemical and geological processes, taking ancient plant material and making it into an almost perfect, ready to go thing you get out of the ground, and you do fractional distillation, and then you're there and running with it, and it's got a lot of energy density. There's a lot of energy per gallon or liter, whatever you want to measure. And there has been a lot of it in the past. Now we're starting to see that potential decline. And you look at other things, you can look at waste oils and things from McDonald's. Yeah, you can run your car on those things, but how many McDonald's are there? How many French fry oil things are there? And so when you start doing the numbers, it doesn't quite work the way you want it to. But yeah, let's use everything we got. I mean, it makes total sense. If we got bag gas in Louisiana, let's try to find a way of making it useful. We'll deal with a pollutant at the same time we're giving ourselves a bit of an energy break. Yes. Oh, I can go 600 miles as long as I put gas in it. That's the secret. And it's one reason why I have a PHEV and not an EV. Because, if I had a Tesla that had the range to go to New Orleans and back easily, that'd be one thing. But that's a lot of money extra just to go to New Orleans. Yes.
Don't you think also that putting regulation?
Well, one individual can only drive one car at a time. So, but per household, yeah, this is the United States, and I will say that kind of solution is not going to really sit very well with most Americans. So I think about that practicality issue.
Actually, in China, they have days for
Yeah, it's a mess. I mean, the last time I was flew into Beijing, I was in shock because I could actually see the ground, and they have a lot of, because red's a lucky color in China. You can see the whole city has a red coloration to it. But I've realized that I was there at the one time of year when they didn't have the inversion problem that they have a lot of the rest of the year, so that they had pretty good atmosphere that day. It's also a big problem in cities in the northeast of China when they light up their boilers as the season gets cold at the end of the fall. They produce a great deal of photochemical smog, and it's now becoming a cripplingly bad problem, a real health problem. Anything else? Thank you.
All right, our third presenter today is Mr. Harry Warhoff. He's the Deputy Director for Coastal Activities for the Governor's Office. In addition to serving as legal counsel to the chairman of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Board, Harry manages the office's efforts to coordinate and focus the function of state agencies on integrated coastal protection. In this role, Harry represents the governor on the Louisiana Oyster Task Force and the State Mineral and Energy Board, right? Different agencies. He also serves as a designee and the chair of the Governor's Climate Initiative Task Force and Louisiana's point of contact for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Renewable Energy Task Force. Prior to joining the governor's office, he served as the Environmental Section Chief and Assistant AG for the Louisiana Department of Justice, where he represented the state and its agencies in a wide variety of matters, ranging from environmental, oil and gas, wildlife and fisheries, interstate river compacts, coastal and appellate law. He earned a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD magna cum laude from Tulane University.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. So today I'm going to focus on the state's newly adopted climate action plan. How many of you in the audience are aware that the state now has a climate action plan, or that the governor had created a climate initiative? All right, so we got a couple. I guess those 49 public meetings in the last 15 months didn't get the whole audience, but more on that in a minute. So I will do a little background on the reason why we need to mitigate climate change, and then go into the process by which the Governor's Climate Initiative Task Force created this climate action plan that was unanimously adopted January 31st earlier this year, and then go into implementation. So why does Louisiana need to address the root cause of climate change? And Bren already got into it a little bit, but you just look outside the window in the last couple hurricane seasons, and you'll see we had a record-breaking hurricane season in 2020, both for the number of named storms that impacted Louisiana, as you can see here. Also, Hurricane Laura was one of the strongest hurricanes to hit Louisiana in recorded history, only to be matched the following. Having a hard time advancing. You go next slide. The following year, last hurricane season by Hurricane Ida tied Laura for the 5th strongest hurricane to hit continental US. Both Hurricane Ida and Laura were both rapidly intensifying storms, meaning they got stronger by 30 miles per hour wind speed or more in a 24-hour period. And so that gives us less time to prepare for storms, less time for people to evacuate ahead of storms. So it is a big deal that we are seeing more, and we are projected to see even greater instance of stronger hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the clicker. There we go. We not only have faced strong hurricanes down here in South Louisiana, but we also have this coastal crisis that Bren mentioned as well. And really, this is looking at relative sea level rise. And looking back, over the last 100 years, our subsiding coast has really been driven, or our coastal crisis have been driven by the subsidence and erosion issues that are being experienced out there. Looking ahead, that main driver of coastal land loss is going to be sea level rise. And really, with every additional inch of sea level rise, that is an additional inch of levee lifts that we need to plan for. That is an additional inch of sediment deposition or marsh creation that we need to plan for. So mitigating against the root cause of climate change is very much a component of integrated coastal protection for the state of Louisiana. And so I think Bren might have shown these slides as well, but as you can see on the left, this is a land loss projections, and on the right, the flood depths from a storm that has a 1% chance of hitting in any given year. And in the high scenarios, you have more land loss and you have deeper flooding. And then, to be sure, climate change is not just about storms and sea level rise. There are other disasters or stressors to humanity, really, with health and safety, hotter days, drought that impacts, the elderly, the infirmed, younger populations. Certainly, we're seeing disproportionate impacts across the board, whether it's responding to flood events or evacuating. There are also economic risks. Certainly 100% agree with you, Dr. Delia, about, it is not just what Louisiana does, and it's not just what the United States does. We need to follow China. I mean, we need China and other countries to get on board. But China is also producing the most electric vehicles out of any country in the world. They're also producing the most solar panels out of any country in the world. So there is certainly an economic component and an economic resilience by addressing the root cause of climate change head on and being the leader in decarbonizing not only transportation, but heavy industry as an example. It does nobody good, any good, doesn't do the world any good if we regulate industry out of existence, because they're just going to move to a different state or a different country. And that doesn't actually reduce the emissions. We need to work with universities. We need to work with industry to figure out the technological advances. And that's where I hope all of you can come in and create those technological advances to bring industrial emissions down as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And so I'll skip over this. I think I've hit y'all over the head enough with that wind up. And again, we've already heard about the state's coastal master plan and the adaptive governance. So in the interest of time, I'll just move on. But basically, the point is that we are now, as a state, taking a very comprehensive effort at both climate adaptation, but also climate mitigation. To be sure, the state's coastal program in protecting and restoring our coastal wetlands is indeed having a significant impact on one of our largest carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks in our coastal wetlands. But as I'll get into in a moment, the climate action plan really complements that very well and identifies some ways to really maximize the sequestration that happens in our coastal wetlands. And so how can Louisiana do its part to mitigate climate change? In 2020, Governor John Bel Edwards signed Executive Order 2020-18, where he really charged Louisiana with proactively working to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving up sea levels, making storms more intense, and impacting the health, safety, quality of life, and economic vitality of our state. And he identified these emissions reduction targets that are in line with those identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Ipcc, which is the UN's working group to identify ways to, well, one, to pull together all of the peer-reviewed science across the world to understand climate change, and then to project out different pathways to get us to where we need to be in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so the governor created in that executive order a climate initiatives task force and tasked it with two main duties. One, reviewing the greenhouse gas inventory efforts that were underway. And the governor's office commissioned the LSU Center for Energy Studies to update the state's greenhouse gas inventory. LSU Center for Energy Studies had done that previously in 2010 and 2000. And so kind of by happenstance, we were on this 10-year track, although we're looking to do it more often because you can't address what you're not measuring. And so you need to, in order to make data informed decisions, you need the best available information. And if that's not available, you go out and make it available by creating it. But the larger effort was really to develop a suite of policies, strategies, and incentives designed to get the state to net zero by 2050, while also improving the health and welfare of the people of Louisiana and advancing our economic and energy profile. And so really a balanced approach is what the governor was looking for. And we delivered that climate action plan on January 31st, or we approved it on the 31st and got it to the governor on his desk by the 1st. So nothing like a good deadline to make you hit your marks. And so the task force was a 23-member body made up largely by, or significantly by state government. So governor's cabinet members, Mr. Haas was also on our task force representing CPRA. We had other independently elected executive branch officials like representation from the Public Service Commission, which regulates utilities, which is a very important perspective to have when coming up with recommendations. We also had the legislature, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House both had representatives on the task forces, as well as the Commissioner of Agriculture and Forestry. In addition to state government, we also had academia, we had community members and community groups, advocacy groups, environmental justice groups. We also had industry very squarely at the table as well. And so really took a big tent approach in bringing together as many different stakeholders who often aren't at the same table together in talking about climate change or other issues, because we felt it's important to have a lot of different perspectives at the table and everyone at the table if we're actually going to move the needle and not just create a plan that ends up on a shelf because it isn't implementable. We wanted something that was, again, balanced and implementable. And so we had, as part of that, in order to achieve it, we held a very open and public process. So over the 15 months, we had 49 public meetings, so more than 3 public meetings in a month, every month for these 15 months, which is a big lift, but it's very important to get that engagement. And then we had several rounds of weeks-long public comment periods, starting off with a 2-month period to solicit proposals from the public, because we wanted anybody and everybody, to submit ideas, because we did not have any sort of monopoly on ideas. We wanted to synthesize what people were offering and coming up with, and that's exactly what we did over these 15 months. And we were supported significantly by experts in their fields and stakeholders in these 6 sector committees that are broken down by generally where emissions are coming from and the economy. And then we had 4 advisory groups that really infused their disciplines into each and every policy recommendation and the suite overall, to make sure that we were very explicit about considering things like equity and science and the economy and law, because you don't get good policy making if you're not intentional about including those disciplines in particular. And so this outlines a little bit of the planning process. Again, it was very open and transparent, and it was also very iterative. We wanted to make sure that we gave the public and our committees and advisory groups several rounds of review and ability to refine, to improve, and make sure that we were on the right track, that we were at the right scale, that we were not creating unintended consequences. And I think the end product really speaks to that, the value of that process. And you can see basically over the 15 months, we were in heart of the pandemic. So most of our meetings were virtual. And so at the end, but a little spoiler, we have a tremendous trove of YouTube videos of these 3-hour public meetings. If you're ever interested in going back and watching them, or if you ever have insomnia, they're both great, worth checking out. I would say give a particular plug for those that are there are two in particular that focused on industrial emissions, because that is a majority of our emissions, as we saw earlier. And so it's not a very intuitive area to decarbonize. It's not a particularly easy area to decarbonize. And so I think that's very helpful just to get a baseline understanding. And so the governor, as I mentioned, didn't just say reduce greenhouse gas emissions at all costs and come up with recommendations to do that. He wanted a balanced suite of solutions. And so, yes, so the task force early on developed these fundamental objectives to really say, yes, the ultimate goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not doing it in a bubble. And so we need to also balance and consider the impacts of different policies on things like health and quality of life. We heard a moment ago, the potential benefits of electric cars, or you can reduce other air pollutants as well. As an example, creating a more equitable society. How do you structure your policies so it may be more accessible or more affordable, like a grant program versus a loan program, where somebody might not have the initial capital to participate in a loan program, but if it's a grant program, that may be more accessible. So things like that of how do you shape your policies, strengthening the economy and workforce. To be sure, we want to drive investment into this state, and particularly in this low carbon, no carbon energy transition that we're experiencing right now. Conserving our natural resources, again, I'll address it in a moment, but the extent to which we can bolster and have more marsh creation projects, more coastal restoration projects, and finance them through this climate initiative, the better, right? We'll be able to kind of capture this co-benefit of conserving more natural resources, as well as adapting to climate change, right? We do not want to put forward maladaptive projects that aren't thinking about the future impacts of climate change that are already baked into the atmosphere, really. And then managing for short and long-term success. Governor Edwards is indeed term limited, and we will have a new governor come January 24th. And so we want to make sure that this does not end with the next governor. Really, this is so I should say governors, because this is a decades-long effort. And so we need all of our institutions, partners, stakeholders to really take hold, bite off what they can chew, and really be collaborative in this process to move it forward for the long term. I know we've seen a couple slides from the greenhouse gas inventory that LSU conducted, but I do want to just kind of go over a few more as well. And I guess before diving into it, I will say that we use the EPA's state implementation tool as just a standard, well-accepted methodology. And that was the same methodology that was used in 2010, so it was good for comparison purposes. And I'll also note, you see that last bullet point, it was finalized in October 2021, so well into the planning process. So we were flying a little bit blind when, with respect to how much progress have we made since 2005, which is, was the baseline for those emission reduction targets. And as you can see, unfortunately, we have not made any progress really since 2005. Louisiana has been very stable in its emissions, which is interesting because the actual source of those emissions has actually changed. About our power production, electric power production has actually, the emissions from there have actually declined significantly and are about 19-20% down from their 2005 levels. They're more than that from the peak, which was in 2011. But those gains, so to speak, were offset by increases in industrial emissions. And so you've already seen this slide, which shows, Louisiana is the only state with a majority and indeed a vast majority of its emissions coming from industry. And industry itself is mainly in Louisiana. The emissions are coming from about nearly half from chemical manufacturing, followed by petroleum refining, because we don't have too much coal product, coal product refinement. And then a distant but still significant third is natural gas processing. So that's I think very helpful it was very helpful for the task force to identify where where our emissions are coming from, and so we can start to grapple with how to decarbonize bulk chemical manufacturing, as an example, which is, again, not very intuitive. Go check out those YouTube videos; they're very helpful. But there are a lot of different ways to reduce emissions, and that's something that, again, that I think Louisiana is poised to be a leader in decarbonization, because if we can do it here, then we can export that knowledge to other states, other countries. And that's, again, part of the whole riding the economic wave of the energy transition. And I did mention this already, that you can see our reduced emissions in power production here. And then our power generation fuel mix. So Louisiana is in fact top 10 in terms of lowest emissions per megawatt hour of power produced. And so, yeah, that's a good thing. And a lot of that is because we have about half as much coal as the national average. We have a significantly higher amount of natural gas, that's 71%. And a lot of those gains that you saw in the couple slides ago were really in the retirement of old inefficient gas turbines and some coal power plants. But that's really in the efficiency. But if, again, efficiency can only get you so far, given where developing nations are, given the fact that there's over 1 billion people in the world that suffer from energy poverty and don't have access or regular access to electricity. So efficiency is not going to get us there. We need, ultimately, it certainly helps and it buys time, but really in the end, we need to get to these significantly low emissions or no emission technologies or energy sources. I think this slide is also very helpful in looking at the bright side. If you're an optimist we are a top 10 state in terms of lowest emissions from our power production sector, but we've only have 2.5% renewables if you combine in the hydroelectric right there. So we have a tremendous upside in terms of deployment or even getting of renewables to get even up to the national average of 15% renewables. So I think we're playing a bit of catch up. We've benefited from low natural gas prices, and that's really, I think what helped drive the investment in the next generation of combined cycle, very efficient natural gas turbines. But now with the continual plummet of the cost of onshore solar, as well as onshore wind, but Louisiana is not great for onshore wind. And we expected the same kind of plummets for batteries and for offshore wind, which Louisiana does have a good opportunity to really invest in that area. Speaking of being driven by data, we wanted to make sure that we were evaluating the impact and potential impact of various policies as we were evaluating them. We kind of stumbled into this tool, this energy policy solutions tool that was developed by Energy Innovation, just kind of fell into our lap, and you can toggle on and off different policies to determine their impact on Louisiana's emissions. We used, they were looking at Louisiana's actual emissions profile. So they match that up, and it's an open source tool. I highly recommend all of you going to toggle, go to the website, toggle things on and off, see how if you can build your own way to get to net zero. I think you'll find that you kind of need to do everything across the board to get there. But so that's a lot of wind up for the actual climate action plan. I'm not going to get into all 84 specific actions, but again, we really looked at everything under the sun and evaluated and synthesized ideas and didn't leave any sectors of the economy out. And the upshot is that we can achieve net zero. It is achievable. You need to be aggressive in your implementation. It's very difficult. It requires concerted effort across the board, but we can do it. And really the three big pillars are renewable electricity generation, industrial electrification to address some of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in the industrial sector, things like powering pumps and compressors. But then there's other processes, industrial processes that require high temperature heat. There's also process emissions by the chemical process creating a stream of CO2. So that, for instance, would require carbon capture and sequestration or offsets. And then fuel switching to hydrogen, low or no carbon hydrogen to create that high temperature process heat that's needed for things like ethane cracking and other industrial processes. Oh. So this is, again, the various sections of the portfolio. I won't go into it, but recommend going to the website and you can really dive into what interests you. I will note this kind of goes back to the process of creating a climate action plan. We did allow for, so I mentioned unanimously approved by our 23-member task force with a very diverse set of perspectives on how to get to net zero. But I think it's important that they all voted in favor of it because they understood not only folks who you might think are environmentalists or not, but I mean everybody agreed that we need to do something because the status quo was unacceptable given where what South Louisiana is facing today and into the future. But we also wanted to recognize and help people get there because there were a few policies or proposals in the climate action plan that some people could not live with, and it wasn't a majority. In fact, 55 of the 84 did not receive any dissent, and a majority of those actions that did receive dissent were from one task force member. And so I think that just again goes to show a tremendous amount of consensus on the ideas and the types of policies that we need to get to net zero. So just an aside, but I thought it was worth pointing out that not everybody agrees on how to get up the mountain, but we all agree that we need to get up there. I will dive into a couple of the strategies and actions. And so that middle one in particular, to restore and conserve Louisiana's coastal wetlands to maximize climate mitigation and adaptation goals. I think that one really spoke to the notion that you can have multiple benefits, and if you're intentional about it and looking for them, you can really capture those, not only sequestering more carbon through our coastal wetlands, but also serving as that first line of defense and creating more habitat and the like. And so the specific actions that are under this strategy were to optimize carbon sequestration through marsh creation projects and the implementation of the coastal master plan, quantifying and monitoring those benefits, and really to help spur investment to look into developing a market-specific like carbon trading program or something like that to bring in more investment and private dollars into the coastal program to finance marsh creation projects, as an example. I also want to emphasize, the inclusive and low carbon economy section, and really, in particular, strengthening climate education, research, and innovation as a focus of Louisiana's energy transition. Our institutions of higher education and research are just ideal for carrying on and really institutionalizing some of the work that has gone on under the banner of the governor's climate initiatives, and to really pursue in partnership different grant programs like the bipartisan infrastructure law to research, what those problems, those engineering problem statements are, so that we can work through them. As an example, I was actually just at the GOMCon earlier this morning talking about offshore wind. Louisiana has potential for offshore wind, but we have lower wind speeds than the East Coast and the North Sea. We have softer soils. We have more birds. We're a tremendous flyway. So we need to work with our research institutions to work through those. Those are engineering solutions waiting to happen. And so, and then that's what I want to import to this group is that there's so much research opportunity, not only on offshore wind or other coasts, but really across the board. And so you can dive in where where your interests lay. And then just in the interest of time, I think I hit that point well enough. Again, you can go into the climate action plan, and in the back, we have an implementation matrix to really identify, what are some of those next steps? Does it need funding? Does it have funding? And the like to really kind of go from a very high level paragraph in the action plan to kind of the immediate next steps. And so the governor came to our March task force meeting after accepting the climate action plan. He endorsed the goals that were outlined in there as an example for offshore wind, creating 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035 in the Gulf of Mexico as a signal and a goal that we should work towards. We're also heavily exploring opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the IIJA, and the governor identified an infrastructure czar or coordinator to work across state government to make sure that Louisiana is as competitive as we possibly can be, and that we know already from the Biden administration, climate and equity, workforce, they're all priorities in terms of the competitive grants. And now that we have a climate action plan, that puts our workforce and economy and equity at the forefront, we can be as competitive as we possibly can. And so these are just some of it's $1 trillion infrastructure law. These are just some of the categories, not going to get into the details, but they're myriad. The task force, now that we have a climate action plan, will continue to meet quarterly to really chart progress, can make sure that we're serving as that connective tissue as needed to bring people together, to bring stakeholders together, and identify gaps in things like research or funding, or where the state needs to act, doing so. We will also, in addition to the quarterly meetings, have biannual meetings where there are workshops with all our advisory groups and committees and the public. So you're all welcome to come. We just had our first one in March. We'll have another one in the fall to really, to dive in, to get engaged, to figure out where you fit into the implementation plan as it's developing. And I already addressed this, but I just wanted to emphasize again to this audience that, as y'all are entering your careers, I believe, you're going to be working through this energy transition. If ideally you'll be working, through 2050. And so this is really your moment to work on some component of this for at least your early career, if not most of your career. And so I think of that myself. I'll be hopefully near the age of retirement by 2050. So that's kind of the rest of my career. And so I think there's ample opportunity for those students and those kind of getting their master's or doctorate to really think about it in that sense of what are you going to want to do with the rest of your career if you want to live on this planet, as I think one of the headlines that we've seen already referenced. But anyway, the YouTube page, Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force, check it out. And then on the governor's website, gov.louisiana.gov, under programs, Climate Initiatives Task Force, and you can find as much information on this as you'd like. And if you have any questions, you can email Lindsay Cooper, who is here in the audience, and happy to answer any other questions. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
This is very interesting. Can you get
Yeah, so I think transportation, there's unfortunately, because we had to focus so much, or we thought it was wise to focus significantly on the industrial sector as something that is perhaps is unique in many ways to Louisiana. I think in the transportation sector, we will largely ride, the coattails of California and other states that are kind of maybe leading the pack on some of the passenger vehicles. But I do think we have a unique component with respect. I mean, we are a multimodal hub for freight, right? And so we have, a significant maritime industry, significant rail corridor and nexus, as well as surface transportation with long haul. And so I think putting all those together, I think, working with our ports is something that they've been very engaged as well, thinking about what are, the large, multinational shipping companies, they're looking to decarbonize as well. It's not likely going to be a battery, given the weight of the battery. So are they, they're looking into things like, maybe hydrogen, but hydrogen is a tiny molecule that's leaky, and it leaks from pipes. So, is it going to be ammonia, which, requires another degree of transition from hydrogen, and, but so you lose, it's more expensive, you lose kind of energy in the process, but things like that. I think there are plenty of areas where we can kind of focus in on for Louisiana, like what are our priorities. But I would say shipping is a big one that I think, given, we are South Louisiana as a complex, I think is the 5th busiest port in the U.S. If you take it in its aggregate, I think we have a tremendous role to play right there. And then, some of the examples in terms of creating a more equitable society is how you frame them, but how you frame and structure the program or the grant or the policy. But then there's also things like, mitigating, deploying renewables, if you can do it affordably, should also improve air quality. Looking into carbon capture and sequestration. If you have to pull out some of the other pollutants like NOx or SOx, do you have an air quality benefit from that as well? So just trying to be intentional about capturing as many co-benefits as possible, avoiding unnecessary harms and the like. I think I guess we'll see, but I completely agree that, while per capita, we are one of the highest emitting states, we export. The truth is we export our emissions, we export bulk chemicals, we export gasoline, jet fuel, around the country. And so, we wanted to, in our approach, sort of not try to export the cost or, kind of push off the responsibility. We said, okay, if people are going to demand these products, how do we can we come up with policies to make sure that these products are low carbon or no carbon, or identify ways that kind of alternatives that are low or no carbon. So assuming that the market pull is still exists, but I mean, it's completely true that that New York, for all their aspirations, I mean, they're purchasing jet fuel that was refined in Louisiana, or gasoline. So there is some accounting that needs to happen and some responsibility that needs to be factored in. So certainly, I think that opens the opportunity for partnerships and ideally funding from these states that have their own mandates and like to tout that they are doing so well and much more advanced than perhaps Louisiana may be. But I think they need to account for the whole life cycle of their emissions or their activities, and not just those that are emitted in their state. And do you have a question as well? Mm-hmm.
Replicated into a leveraged partnership.
Oh, that'd be great, because I mean, bulk chemicals comes top of mind. I mean, other regions and localities around the world that are producing, ammonia just like we are. And what can we do to exchange information to kind of build an ecosystem of collaboration to so everybody can reduce their emissions? Yeah, great point. Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that'd be great. Engagement with our all hands meetings, as well would be, but in the interim before the fall, just emailing with, I think it would be great, to get the ball rolling, because certainly we don't want to leave any technology kind of off the table. And, we've taken an all of the above strategy in terms of reducing emissions. So.
I think Dr.
Yeah.
We know that Louisiana has
I mean, I hate to just keep going back to it, but the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law is a great opportunity, and there's competitive grants, and so to the extent we can work in partnership and strengthen a proposal, all the better. I think that kind of, again, building the big tent approach and bringing as many partners in as possible, I think can only make you a stronger applicant. But there's a lot of competitive money for even R&D and things like that. So that's where I would key in on.
Yes. The question is like, you mentioned like the emissions in Louisiana are related to the industrial sector. So do you have any strategy on how you're going to reach to these companies in order to move like to more cleaner energy source? because I don't think it's gonna be easy, like to tell them, okay, you have to use like this renewable energy or this hydrogen. So you have strategies in mind that you.
So we were looking into the existing authorities that our Department of Natural Resources and Department of Environmental Quality have already, in terms of, potential opportunities for, tightening regulations or better understanding the best available control technology, which is a standard in and of itself that looks at, the economic viability of a pollution control technology, which would include greenhouse gases in some instances. But also, I think there's a strong opportunity for partnerships, right? To really pull in the industry leaders, those who are responding to their boards or their shareholders or customers who are asking for low and no carbon products, to partner with them to help advance those technologies and ideally bring down cost as there are learnings from pilot projects and the like. So I think those are a lot of opportunities. We're also hearing from some of the large industrials that they would like to have the ability, for example, to purchase all renewable energy or electricity, I should say. And so making sure that, that's in the province of the Public Service Commission to create what's called a green tariff or a renewable portfolio standard. But those are things that are also, I think, being looked at today. Entergy has an open docket with the Public Service Commission on a green tariff, which is that I'll pay a premium if for green energy. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there, so both kind of that carrot and the stick and pulling in, partners and those who want to be the industry leaders, and kind of help set a new bar for what, market participants are willing to do. And yeah.
We have a question from one of the Zoom participants. It's related to offshore wind. As LSU faculties, how can we effectively participate in the Louisiana offshore wind program? Are there any programs that can help connect academia with industry in offshore wind research and application? Thank you.
Certainly. So we are looking at, currently there's no offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. In 2019, Governor Edwards requested that the federal government start looking at leasing for offshore wind in federal waters. We do, kind of as an analog, have the regulatory framework to let wind leases in state waters in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's ample opportunity. The mechanism, the framework is already there. The federal government is looking to have a lease sale around this time next year. So, that would be for a commercial lease, and there's certainly a lot of moving parts to get there. But in terms of reason, so there's a market that is starting to form, and we're seeing a lot of investment on the East Coast, and hopefully we can take advantage of learnings there and to help bring down the cost. But I think there's also opportunities in pilot projects, partnering with companies like LM Wind, which is out in NASA's Michoud facility that they rent space, and they are GE Renewables, General Electric Renewables, premier North American testing facility for the wind turbine blades, to make sure that they can stand up against the elements, that they perform optimally and the like. So I think there's actually a nice ecosystem of the private sector, universities, government that are all interested in having the conversation and putting together potentially a pilot project to get some steel in the water sooner than later, and so we can start observing and seeing how they perform against things like hurricanes, to make sure that they're avoiding bird mortality from birds running into the wind turbines, any impacts to aquatic species as well. So as well as our fishing industry and avoiding conflict. So there's, I think, many areas to plug in, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that offline as well.
Presentation very much. It's very enlightening. I just want to share something. At Tran-SET, we've been running a lot of projects that have contributed to enhancing sustainability and reducing greenhouse gases. I would love to like maybe share a one-page summary of these projects with you. And if you're interested in anything, let us know and we can give you more information.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
I have one more question about the public comment process. So what does that look like and what are the type of comments you generally see from the participants?
The comments kind of ranged the gamut. And, you had stakeholders who were concerned about some technologies or wanted us to focus only on certain technologies. And so I thought it was robust. We got a lot of feedback with every meeting, with these, public comment periods to actually, redline and make comments on the docket and the draft documents themselves, as well as, early on, as I mentioned, coming up with proposals and submitting them. And so I think that was, part of the strength is that, those public submittals really formed kind of the backbone or baseline of the action plan. So I think that was tremendously helpful. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. While we're setting up for the next speaker, there is coffee and some snacks over there if you all want to help yourself. And I'll go ahead and introduce our fourth presenter today, Mr. Jay Grimes. He's the chief meteorologist at the WAFB-TV, CBS in Baton Rouge, a position that he's had since May 2003. And before that, he was the Louisiana state climatologist from 1991 to 2003. He served at LSU for more than 20 years with faculty posts, professional in residence at the Department of Geography and Anthropology and the Department of Biological and Agriculture Engineering. In addition to his media work, Jay is also a weather consultant for the Governor's Unified Command Group at the GOHSEP and consults with emergency management and school districts professionals in the region. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be here today. The list of heavy hitters that are speaking today, I kind of wonder if they brought in the TV weather guy for a comic relief. Let's see how we do here. This is going to be very different from the talks you've seen thus far. Although I spent a long time at LSU, I haven't done the kind of research or the administrative structuring that you've seen in the previous talks here. Basically, all I do is count things. So I'm going to show you some numbers of the things that I've counted, and we'll go from there. One of the things that we all, I think, would agree on, but sometimes it just needs to be stated, is that when it comes to considering the potential for climate change impacts at the local or regional level, as far as I'm concerned, Louisiana is probably has the potential of being the most adversely impacted state of any state in the nation. And that would even be true if climate change, the degree, the extent of climate change was just on a moderate scale. And our impact is not only in terms of the coastal impact, but also the cultural impact, the business impact. Let's face it, oil and gas and petrochemicals are the backbone of the state and are likely to stay that way for a long time. And yet those are also the sectors that are really under the greatest attack in terms of how they are impacting our local, regional, and ultimately the global climate. Well, let's talk a little bit about that climate. And by the way, this all works out of the first earliest discussions years back, where we weren't talking climate change, we were talking global warming. And have you ever thought about why was it that we jumped on global temperatures as the first index? And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because, quite frankly, if you're going to develop models, modeling global temperatures is certainly easier than modeling global precipitation, because rule number one is global temperatures are latitudinal, right? That's a box you can build and then play with. Dynamics of precipitation, as maybe the other big index of climate change, are not latitudinal, or they're latitudinal and longitudinal. The bottom line is when we start trying to look at precipitation, it becomes much, much more complex. So all of you have seen the traces of global temperatures over the last 100+ years. So what I've done is I've just presented you here the trace of Louisiana annual temperatures from 1975 to current. You can see a pretty steady upward trend. In fact, a change of almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a degree plus centigrade, in roughly 50 years. So at that rate, you might be thinking, well, things are going to be heading south quickly. But here's the thing. Let's look back before then. And what we actually see is that we're now as warm as we used to be. And it's just important to understand this from a local scale. That doesn't mean that the whole globe has experienced this kind of pattern. But for Louisiana, we're not all that out of line with what we've experienced the past 100 years. And for me, frankly, that's the end of the temperature discussion for Louisiana, because for me, I think that the bigger index is rainfall. And what we have seen in Louisiana is an upward trend in rainfall, although as you look at this annual trace dating back to the 1890s, I think that you'll agree that, in fact, really the year-to-year variability is a much bigger deal than the 10% increase. And I want you to notice that over that time scale, that year-to-year variability stays relatively constant. So we have seen an increase, an uptick in the rain amounts by about 10% over the last 100 years. But trying to plan around the interannual variability is really a bigger issue. And one of the things that I also wanted to point out is if you look at the wetter period, which can we knock that screen back? Thank you. There you go. So we also had a very wet period there from the 80s into the 90s, more of the variations that the folks along the coast, and in fact, folks statewide, have to deal with. And this impacts not only the coastal zone, but it impacts agriculture statewide. To me, I really think that the precipitation variability is a bigger concern for Louisiana than the variations in temperatures. Here's just a look at the annual series for two of the state's parishes, Cameron Parish and St. Bernard Parish down along the coast. And you see that both of those parishes also demonstrating that upward trend, maybe a little bit of a greater increase in the southwestern parishes than in the southeastern parishes, but still what jumps out more than that slight upward trend is the variability over time. So we've seen the increases statewide. That trends are certainly impactful along the coast, but they're impactful well inland as well. Another thing that it came out of, and some of you probably weren't here in August 2016, but maybe you've heard about the mega flood that impacted the greater Baton Rouge area. Well, one of the things a lot of people in Baton Rouge don't realize is that there was a coincident flood of equal magnitude in the Lafayette area. It just never got the attention because everybody was worried about what was happening here in the Red Stick. But the thing that came out of some of that work is that on the left-hand side here, you'll see that the frequency of these big rains along the Gulf Coast has increased dramatically. The amount of rain that falls hasn't changed all that much, but the frequencies of these events has in fact increased considerably. And then I went in and did my usual counting because I wanted to know, okay, is that true for the state of Louisiana? So one of the things I looked at was events of 20 inches or more in just a 2-day window. Now understand, you might say, well, how did you come up with that? And it's somewhat random, but also when we want to look back in history in Louisiana weather and climate, we've got very limited resources. And we do have data that goes back into the 1800s, but only for a handful of locations. So what I did was I looked back to 1930, and I looked from 1931 actually to 1990, 60 years, and I only found 2 events. Now, keep in mind, 20 inches of rain, that's the equivalent of 4 months worth of rain for the state. That fell in 2 days, 20 inches in 2 days. 2 events in 60 years. Now we look from 1991 to current, and you see there have been 4 events in half the time. And the other thing I want you to notice is if you look at the 31 to 90 events, both of those August dates, they were both tropical events. When you look at the 4 more recent events in the last 30 years, 2 of them were non-tropical, which is a reflection of a change in the precipitation pattern as well as the frequency. So we're no longer simply looking at tropical events to be the big rainmakers for the Bayou State. And in fact, when we look at the big events nationwide, and this is where we start moving from climate to social impacts. Of the 10 biggest payouts for flood insurance, the NFIP program, Louisiana is involved in 6 of them. We are a wet state, but we're also a heavily flood-prone state. And if we're going to be getting wetter, as the trend has shown in the last 100 years, the frequency of us being on this list is likely to stay elevated as well. So part of this, and some of you maybe have heard, a number of parishes now are implementing these brief, typically 1 year, sometimes 6 months. EBR is even considering it, moratoriums on building. And so Ascension Parish has had one that's about to come to its end of its 1 year hiatus on construction of, principally these were directed at neighborhood developments. And the folks in Ascension Parish just asked me to take a quick look at this. So again, I'm not saying that this is the best analysis, but it was just a quick and dirty hands-on analysis to look at big rainfall events in Gonzales, Louisiana, the center of Ascension Parish. And what you can see there is that over the period of roughly 40 years, 41 years, 43 years actually, in the first half of the period, rain events of 6 inches or more in 2 days, they certainly weren't rare. They popped up now and again. In fact, over a 20-year period, there were 10 of them between 1979 and about the year 2000. But since 2000, the number has not only increased, but now and in recent years, in the last 7 or 8 years, there have been years where they had multiple events of these 6-inch rains. So what we've got then is really a double whammy for the folks in Ascension Parish. It looks like these large rain events are becoming more common. Plus, think about it. Every time you take a forest and turn it into a pasture, and take that pasture and turning it into a neighborhood or a shopping center, you're increasing the amount of runoff that's being produced. You're effectively flooding or producing an opportunity for greater flood impacts. And this is the sort of the mindset behind these moratoriums for construction. Now, the thing is, these moratoriums I don't think are especially effective if you take a year and say you can't build without coming up with a new plan to implement. And thus far, no one has been able to come up with that kind of solution. So for Ascension Parish, the frequency of these flood events seems to be increasing while the sort of the open free space is decreasing. Why? Because it's one of the faster growing parishes in the state. How is the parish and ultimately how is the state going to manage issues like this if we're going to continue to get even wetter over time? This is a look at the breakdown of those events in Gonzales, and you see that these 6-inch rain events can occur any time of year. They're most common in the warm months, which is not a surprise, and a number of them are related to tropical events, but only about 1/4 or 1/5 are tropical events. And again, this becomes a problem then because now we're looking at an increase in the frequency of these events and the fact that they aren't only limited to tropical storm events. So what about that local flood future? And one of the things that it's important that folks understand is that we live in the wettest state of the lower 48. Only Hawaii averages more rain than Louisiana. In fact, our neighbor Mississippi is right behind us. But at an average of about 60 inches of rain a year, there's plenty of water more often than not. And it's far from certain, but there are indications that the region is going to get stormier, wetter in the coming decades while we continue to increase in population and increase in development, which only means having to manage more water, more runoff. Now, the real question becomes, and what a lot of folks are concerned about is, are these mega floods like the 2016 event going to become more frequent? Well, first of all, we've labeled that storm the 1 in 1,000 year event. Where does that number come from? How do you come up with a 1,000 year event when you only have 80 years of data? I mean, we can plot points on a log scale all we want, but Mother Nature doesn't work that way. And the likelihood is that this is nowhere near, that event was nowhere near a 1 in 1,000 year event. And in fact, the reality is we had 2 of these events on literally the same day, 50 miles apart. And as I showed you a minute ago, these 20-inch rains are much more common statewide than most people thought. So these kinds of big events are likely to become more common, and particularly in the developed portions of the coastal zone, and in fact, anywhere in developed Louisiana, these are going to become more problematic, certainly in the greater Baton Rouge area where we continue to grow. All right, so dealing with all of that, I get a lot of questions from folks, and these questions have been coming especially since the 2016 flood event. And they literally asked me, should I consider flood insurance? Now, this is going to sound a little flippant, but I say, well, if you're thinking about flood insurance, there's 2 questions you have to ask yourself. The first one is, do you live in South Louisiana? The second one is, has it ever rained in your backyard? And the fact is, if you can say yes to both of those questions, in our area, you need flood insurance. So just something to think about there. So that's a quick and dirty look at rainfall. Let's change it up a little bit. Let's talk about hurricanes, which is sort of the bigger issue in Louisiana. Most people are much more concerned about tropical weather. And when we talk about tropical weather in Louisiana, most folks know what a hurricane is, and they know everything about them. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here when it comes to tropical weather. So what is a hurricane and where do they come from? If you know this, you're in good shape. But let's get on to the real stuff here. Many of you have already seen the forecast from Colorado State. If you look at the bottom, average number of named storms, 14 named storms, 7 as hurricanes, 3 of those hurricanes as major storms. And Colorado State, which gets all the press time, put out their forecast of 19, 9, and 4. So they're calling for an above average year. Wait a minute, haven't we had 6 consecutive above average years? Yes. And haven't we had 7 seasons in a row that have started before the quote official start date of hurricane season, June 1st? Yes, we are in a very active spell. But I wanted to show you that Colorado State's not the only group that puts out numbers. In fact, a lot of these groups put out their forecast a day or 2 before Colorado just to beat them to the punchline. They just don't get the press time. I don't want you to be focused on the absolute numbers, but I want you to see the pattern. Every forecast group is calling for a busy year this season. Here we go again with what looks to be almost certainly going to be now our 7th consecutive season with above normal activity. Here is a hurricane and tropical storm activity for the Atlantic Basin starting back in 1900. The red bar, the red portion of the stacked bar are the number of hurricanes, and then stacked on top of that, the orange is the number of tropical storms. So if you look at the top of the bar, that kind of gives you the indication of the frequency of named storms over the last 120 years. And I think most of you would probably see that trend there. Now, I would propose that maybe it's not, because first of all, we all know Mother Nature does nothing linearly. Nothing works like that. So maybe it's not really quite like that, and maybe it's more a little bit like this. Now, a really good statistician would come to me and say, Jay, you can't do that. And I would say, sure I can, it's my slide. But what I want to show you is the mechanism that may be at play here. First off, where we see that first step, that just happens to correspond with when we started aircraft reconnaissance, where we were no longer dependent upon ships at sea to track storms. And by the way, if you think about it, aircraft reconnaissance began in the Second World War. It was initiated not for hurricane science, it was initiated to protect the Navy during the Second World War. One thing we found out right away was, hey, this is a great idea because it helps everybody out. And in fact, if you think about it today, even today, the Air Force Reserve is actually the principal hurricane hunting group for the Atlantic Basin. So there's the first uptick. Tell me, what's the second uptick? You all know the answer. What's the next bit of technology that changed the game? Satellites. 24/7, 365. Now we're watching them. Remember, with the aircraft, somebody had to say, you need to go out here and look. We don't have to say that anymore. We got the satellite doing it for us. Then we send the aircraft out. So you see, what I would argue is an explanation for that stepwise function. And I'll show you a little bit more here to show you just how important satellites have become in terms of these storm numbers. If we look at just the tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and tropical storms that lasted for 2 days or less, look at that. And why is that? Because we're now seeing storms way out in the open Atlantic that nobody ever counted before. So what I'm trying to show you here is that at least a large part of that uptick in numbers is technology. It may not really just be Mother Nature. That said, we've been on a roll here. And since 1995, still clearly it's been somewhat hyperactive. As you can see it with the numbers there, including the 2 most active seasons and something like 7 of the 10 most active seasons in the last 30 years. Now, regardless of the fact that the technology has upped those numbers a bit, still there's something definitely going on there. Mother Nature is definitely at it in terms of the tropical weather. So what I've done now is I've changed things up a little bit and decided, well, let's use just the Gulf of Mexico. Now, again, a good statistician would say, well, the Gulf isn't a random selection. It's a geographically selected subset. And I agree it is. But what you see here is that you've got kind of a pattern that maybe suggests a low run of years, an uptick of years, another low run of years, and then a second uptick. Now, my argument here is that think of the Gulf of Mexico as a billiard table, and storms are the billiard balls. Sooner or later, every billiard ball is going to hit a bumper. So even back at the turn of the century, probably just about every storm that formed in the Gulf got counted, whereas storms out in the open Atlantic never got counted. And we also, in fact, the truth is that back at the turn of the century, while we can argue the absolute values of the instrumentation, there were actually more people out there along the Gulf Coast with pressure sensors than there are today. So we had really a pretty good sense of what these storms were doing. And the only reason I bring that up is just because, well, I want to make it a little bit more local. I want to take it to Louisiana. And by the way, when we talk about Gulf storm, 1 in 3 either end up in the Gulf or actually form in the Gulf. So the Gulf is a pretty decent subset, even though admittedly, it's a regionally selective subset of the entire basin. Here's the Louisiana action. And again, what I want you to notice is the uptick at the end of the series. Now, prior to about 1995, we averaged about 7 named storms striking Louisiana every decade. Most people are even surprised at that. By the way, if I was to ask you, name the hurricane state in the United States, which state would it be? It's not a trick question. Florida, yeah. Florida is a big nose sticking out in the Atlantic. Arguably, Florida has 3 coasts: the Atlantic, the Gulf's west-facing coast, and the Panhandle. In fact, and a lot of people don't realize this, the Panhandle is the unlucky coast of the 3. It gets hit more than the other 2. But Florida has about 1,200 miles of coastline. Louisiana has a little over 300 miles, if you sort of linearize it. Now, Florida does get hit more, but per mile of coastline, Louisiana gets hit more frequently than Florida. So we've got this action here in the last few years, and you see that there. 27 named storms in 22 years, more than 1 per year. And just as kind of a round, again, I'm a counter, in your pocket kind of number, it typically takes 2 to 5 years to recover from a storm. Well, with that kind of frequency, we never catch up. And yeah, you can make the argument that, come on, Jay, some of those tropical storms aren't particularly impactful. And that's pretty true. But again, just as a round rule of thumb, if it's got a name, somebody lost a roof. If it's got a name, there is an impact somewhere. It may not make the news, but it is still an impactful event. And what we're dealing with right now is a hyperactivity that we don't know how long it's going to continue, but we do know that this year is going to be another crazy year in terms of activity. And most of those same groups that are forecasting above normal frequency for this hurricane season are also suggesting that there will be a tendency for those storms to get shunted farther west, which means that a higher percentage of those storms will, in fact, make landfall somewhere in the New World, either in the Caribbean, the Gulf, or the East Coast. So we have to be bracing ourselves for yet another year after what we've dealt with in the last handful of years. You see there, the last 20 years. There's a list of the storms that have impacted us since 2000. One of the things I want you to notice is there's really only one quiet spell in there, 2013 to 2016. But look at the frequency of years with multiple hits, including 2020 with 3 hurricanes and a 4th tropical storm. But you've also got 4 other years that had 3 or more hits. We have just been at the mercy of Mother Nature. And in fact, for this 20-year stretch, it's been worse here in Louisiana, I would argue, than even for Florida. And when we talk about the impacts, and this is just a listing of the storms in terms of what we call normalized damage. And what that means is we not only adjust the damage for the current dollars today, but we also adjust it for population, because we have in fact grown. If you were to just look at the impact with dollars alone without population growth, the numbers would be lower. First off, it's still preliminary data. You see Ida. So that's the one we just dealt with. But I want you to look at this list. 10 of the costliest storms in Louisiana has been at the mercy of 5 of them. I just try to reinforce for people that we are a red zone, a hot zone for tropical weather. And for CPRA and for all of the plans that are being put forward, we've got to be thinking about the fact that we're struggling just to keep up with the storm frequencies. And sure, were it to maintain at this recent rate, I'm not sure we can actually keep up with it. So with that, I'll say thank you. And again, just a sense of the frequency, not only of the impacts of precipitation and increased precipitation, but maybe more importantly, how we brace and prepare for tropical weather in the coming years. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jay. Questions?
So I was here during the 2016 flooding. Is there any reason we didn't know about it? It was not predicted like all of the other hurricanes, and even it didn't have a name. So is there a reason for that with the recent technology?
One more time, please.
That is the 2016 flooding.
2016. Well, okay, yeah. Look, in fact, you know, that was it didn't get a name because it never developed a prolonged enough closed circulation. To become a named storm or even to become a tropical depression, it has to get a closed circulation for a period of 6 to 12 hours. And the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service never arrived at that conclusion. Now, that said, it walked like a duck, it quacked like a duck, and it rained like a duck. So what ended up happening is that we never got what would have been an incredible amount of press coverage because it didn't have a name, and so the media ignored it. So you see the kind of damage that we had both in the greater Baton Rouge area and in the greater Lafayette, and it almost went unmentioned in the national news. But the answer is explainable. And it also is a good example of how, you know, maybe we need to come up with some better indices. You know, now one of the indices would be rainfall. 20 inches gets my attention. 20 inches in 48 hours is ridiculous. But it just, you know, and had we called it Tropical Depression Boudreaux, the national news would have been all over it. So it was just simply a matter of it didn't qualify for a name, and therefore it just got overlooked by the national media. Thanks all.
Hello, just a comment about the name storms. So had the national media call or somebody called it Tropical Storm Boudreaux, the amount of money, the amount of damage that the insurance companies would have covered would have been far less for our people. So it's probably a good thing for our people that it was not a named storm, since most insurance companies now have a much higher deductible for named storms than they ever did before.
That's true, but chances are they would have been made up for in like-kind donations if people knew about it. But I agree with you. There's a trade-off there in that yeah, your hurricane deductible would have, your named storm deductible would have kicked in had it had a name. And the truth is, going back, I'm not sure that it never even was tagged a depression. I'm pretty sure it was a depression. And the other thing, and we're seeing new things happen all the time. Last year was a great example. Tropical Storm Cristobal. It didn't become a tropical storm until after it made landfall. That's unheard of. So we're seeing new things because we have the technology to see them that we didn't know was possible. Now, some people say it was the brown water, the marsh was sufficient enough to give it that that boost in energy to become a tropical storm after landfall, but that's not supposed to happen. and with Boudreaux, if we'll go ahead and call it that, it clearly had circulation over land. It just didn't ever quite make the cut. Thanks, folks. Appreciate it. Oh.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I love the fact that you said I'm a counter. I love all the numbers. So, but it brings up an interesting question, the debate about climate change. So you said that a lot of what we're seeing now is related to technology because we are actually looking at satellites, sending things out. So does that mean that you are of the opinion that none of this is related to climate change, or is it partially?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, okay. You know, I have to admit, I not only was I kind of, when I was invited here, I thought, well, they just wanted the weather guy for somebody to laugh at, comic relief. But you heard Dean Delia kind of allude to it at the front there. I am not what, I'm not a climate alarmist. Has climate changed? Absolutely. In fact, I just showed you 100 years of data that shows it's changing all the time. Are humans involved? Absolutely. Is our greenhouse gases a major player? I don't have any question about that. But I will tell you that what we sometimes don't talk about is that landscape change is also a big player in climate change. And I made that mention about forest to pasture to neighborhood. Every time we do that, we warm the local climate. And the summation of local climate change is regional climate change, which ultimately results in global climate change. So what I'm simply trying to point out here is that the hurricane record may not be apples and oranges, but it's not the same apples. But one of the things that we also have to remember is that even when we look at the Atlantic Basin, that's only a part of the story. And what we also know is that when the Atlantic Basin number tends to go up, numbers in other parts of the globe tend to come down. There's a remarkable consistency in the number of hurricanes and tropical storms globally. And the seesaw is principally between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. So when our numbers go up, theirs go down. But if we look at the global numbers, they've been fairly steady over time. So what then becomes the question is, if we were to see an uptick in Atlantic numbers, would the rest of the globe get a little relief? I don't know the answer, but what I do know is that the numbers have been fairly steady over the last 50 to 60 years, where we have really good data, not only for the Atlantic Basin, but for the Pacific and for the Indian Ocean. And that's part of the problem, is that technology keeps changing the rules as we collect data over time. So we can't always look at the past and compare it to today and make conclusions. For example, with that Atlantic data, most researchers will tell you that from the period of 1900 to about 1930, they think that the number of named storms in the Atlantic Basin are probably undercounted on average by 2 a year. So that if you added 2 a year to every one of those earlier years, that upward slope would flatten out a bit. Now, would it go away? I don't think so, because we've been dealing with that hyperactivity in the last 20, 25 years. But we would flatten out the upward slope if we had equivalent data from the earliest years to the current years. In fact, this is why I never look back prior to 1900. We have data that goes back to the 1850s, but I think that that data is even more skewed by observational limitations. Thanks all.
So our next speaker is Mr. Patrick Banks. He served in multiple roles with LDWF since 2001, including head marine biologist for the Pontchartrain Basin prior to Hurricane Katrina, as the statewide oyster biologist for nearly 14 years, biologist director for the Marine Fisheries Section, and administrator for the Fisheries Management Division. He hails from Georgia and holds a BS in Environmental Science from Mercer University and an MS in Zoology from Louisiana State University. He has served as a member of the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission's Oyster Technical Task Force and the Nature Conservancy's Oyster Goals Science Advisory Team, and currently serves as the governor's representative on the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. In his current role with LDWF, Banks oversees all fisheries-related operations and is charged with managing the state's marine and freshwater fish populations and habitats for the conservation and improvement of recreational and commercial. Also, there's pizza if you want.
I might prefer pizza as well. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've been very interested in the talks that came ahead of me. And Jay was talking about needing some comic relief, but unfortunately I had the tough job of following you, Jay. That was extremely interesting, very well put together. And so it's good to meet you in person. I've been watching you on TV for quite some time. As I was introduced, I'm Patrick Banks. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and I oversee the Office of Fisheries. And so my talk is managing fisheries in the face of climate change. We've heard a lot from folks like Bryn and Harry about climate change and what the state is doing to try to help with that situation. And I don't have all of those kinds of great solutions, unfortunately. But what I do want to express to you is what we see in the world of fisheries management, what we see in the world of fisheries biology. And if you didn't even look at the temperature data, if you didn't look at the numbers, you didn't count the numbers, we know something's going on just by watching the animals that we study and that we manage, because things are changing. Not only the animals that are in the water, but the animals that make their living on the water, and that's people, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, charter fishermen. So I'm gonna give I'm gonna touch briefly on Louisiana's fisheries production and why this state is so productive in terms of the numbers and the value of fish. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the climate change examples, which of course you've already heard about, so I'll breeze through that. And then I'll talk about some challenges that are facing fisheries due to climate change, and then just touch briefly on a few solutions that we feel could help the situation. So as many of you may know, Louisiana is extremely productive for fisheries, both commercially and recreationally. Billions of dollars worth of economic activity it's responsible for in Louisiana as well as the nation. It's largely productive because of the Mississippi River and the large estuarine environment that we have in Louisiana. You heard Bryn talk about coastal marshes and things like that. That's an extremely productive environment for our coastal fisheries. And then if you even look at our freshwater areas in central and north Louisiana, very, very productive riverine and swamp areas that produce a lot of great fish like bass and what we'd call in South Louisiana, sac-a-lait. Where I'm from, you'd call them white perch or crappie. But just an extremely productive area for fisheries. And we rank #1 in a lot of categories: oyster production, shrimp production. We have the largest fishery by volume in the lower 48 states. That's menhaden production. So we're an extremely valuable state when it comes to fisheries. And as I talked about, billions of dollars worth of economic activity. Now, it goes without saying that fish and seafood and things like that are part of our cultural identity, and that you really can't put a price on. If you go down to some of these bayou communities, I mean, this is what they've been doing for many, many generations. And so it's what gives us the Cajun flavor here in Louisiana, and very, very important from a cultural standpoint. So we talked a lot about climate change examples. I won't go through that. Jay touched on severe weather events, hurricanes. Bryn talked a little bit about coastal flooding and these sunshine days of flood. as many of you probably have heard about. And this certainly does happen. Places like Delacroix, which is a small fishing community east of New Orleans out in the marsh, the road to Delacroix goes underwater quite often just from regular southerly winds, southeasterly winds. And so a lot of fishermen in that area can't even bring their catch out because of those just sort of normal flooding events these days that used to not be so normal. We talked about increases in air temperature, but obviously that also leads to an increase in water temperature as well. And that's what has the big effect on the species that we manage. And of course, we talked extensively about the expansion of warmer weather. So one animal that's near and dear to my heart, which you probably heard from the introduction, is oysters. So I started studying oysters when I came to LSU in graduate school, and I just found them fascinating animal. All marine invertebrates, in my opinion, are extremely fascinating, much more fascinating than animals with backbones. I don't know why, but that's just my thing. But what we've noticed over the last 30 to 40 years, and it goes along with this cycle that Jay talked about, is maybe the cycle we're in this warmer period, but warmer periods have happened before. But over the last 30 or 40 years, we've noticed a change in the reproductive cycle of things like oysters. And it's not the only animal out there that we're seeing this in, but when an animal like an oyster spawns, it is cued by water temperature. So we used to see it happen when the water's warmed in the spring and when they cooled in the fall. We'd have these two main periods of spawning. It seems that the spring spawn, cued by the increase in water temperature, happens about the same time, but the fall spawn has started happening later and later and later. If you look at our data back about 40 years ago, we would see this occurring in August and September. Now we're seeing it in October and sometimes even into November. And so it's really changed a little bit of the reproductive cycle of this animal, which leads to a change in the production of these baby oysters, which you can see there's all these little dots on the oyster shell beside the dime are baby oysters that are about 3 days old. And then it also changes the way we manage the resource and manage the habitat. One of the key things that we do to manage oysters is we build more habitat. Oyster larvae, after they form in the water column and start to swim, they need something hard and firm to settle on and grow. And so we try to provide that each spring and fall by doing a habitat construction project called mulch planting. Again, we used to do this in September, really September before really those cold fronts started coming through. Now, because of the timing of the animals, we're starting to do this into October and sometimes into November. And in some cases, by the time they spawn and we're able to get the material out with all this heavy equipment, we've had a cold front come through, water starts getting lower, and we've even had some engineering type problems with building these reefs. Sorry, technical difficulties. So another animal that's certainly very secretive, very interesting, highly sought after. And I'm not talking about the beer man. I'm talking about this fish that he's holding called the flounder. We're seeing changes in the stock status of this animal because of changes in water temperature. These animals are very interesting in that at a certain water temperature cues them to change from or just choose male or female as their gender. And so as water temperatures rise, what we are finding is that we have many more males in the population than we used to. The population balance of male to female ratio seems to be out of balance because of that increase in temperature. Now, this is not just something that's happening in Louisiana. You see this all across the Gulf, all up the Atlantic seaboard where southern flounder exists. But what we're finding is because of this change in sex ratios, we have a much smaller stock biomass of females, and so therefore less reproductive output, a decrease in the population size, and so therefore we're probably looking at some fairly restrictive fishing regulations on this animal in the future because of that. And it looks like that it's definitely tied to a climate change issue. Now, the climate change issue obviously is not just impacting these couple of examples of the fish, but the fishing industry as well. And there's other examples in the animal world that we can talk about. We could talk about if any of you all are duck hunters like I am, we're always upset about, or at least the last 10 or 15 years, about the lack of ducks. And there's certainly plenty of evidence to show that duck migration patterns have changed, not just in North America, but even in Europe based on changing temperatures. So there's a lot of examples out there, but we don't just manage the fish or the wildlife resources. We also manage people who make their living on these resources or use them for recreation. And so climate change has had a tremendous impact on these as well. Jay and Harry and everybody has talked about hurricanes. We certainly see hurricanes that seem to be happening more frequently, and certainly the extreme nature of these events seem to be much higher than they used to be. I went through Katrina when I was with the department, just a terrible situation, but I've never seen the amount of structural damage that I saw down in Grand Isle and Lower Lafourche with Hurricane Ida. It was unbelievably devastating. So this leads to things like infrastructure damage. That's a picture of Grand Isle on the right. This is a picture of a shrimp boat up by Lafourche on the left, and you just see these images all over the place. As you can imagine, this has a tremendous impact on our fishing communities. Many of these communities, places like Cocodrie, Chauvin, Grand Isle, Pointe-a-la-Hache, small communities up and down these bayous, their entire economy revolves around commercial fishing for the most part, and in a lot of cases, charter fishing like Grand Isle. And so, and if you go to places like Venice that has a large component of commercial and charter fishing, it also has oil and gas economic activity that helps it. Same way, a little bit with Grand Isle, certainly with Port Fourchon, but places like Cocodrie and Dularge and these tiny, tiny communities that every store that's there, a grocery store, if there's not fishing activity going on, that grocery store sells no groceries. I mean, these communities are so heavily based economically on fishing. And so when things like this happen, their entire economy goes away. So any efforts we can make to try to help these communities recover or become more resilient to these kinds of storms would be entirely helpful, not just for the fishermen, but for everybody in that little community. One of the things we did after Hurricane Ida was our secretary, my boss, directed me to try to help set up some ice plants in strategic locations along some of these bayous. Now, those ice plants were not just to get the commercial fishermen back working, that was to provide ice for the community as well. But in addition, once those commercial fishermen were able to find a source of ice, they were able to go back to work. That generated money that could go to help them try to recover from these hurricanes. So just small little things like that are extremely important for all communities. Of course, flooding, I think Bren talked about flooding and these sunshine day floods. It's very difficult for our fishing communities to get products to the marketplace when their road is constantly underwater, even when there's no tropical activity. In addition to that, our charter industry, which is one of the largest charter fishing industries in the Gulf, next to Florida, of course, can't get clients down to these areas to take them out on trips because the road is flooded. You hear those kinds of stories all the time. So it seems like a small thing for those of us up here in Baton Rouge, and we certainly saw it during the 2016 flood, but these flooding events are more and more numerous and more frequent. So what are some of the solutions, and students like yourself who will be coming up with these kinds of solutions are really the key for us, but some of those solutions are built up, obviously. Move inland. That doesn't always work necessarily for fishing, because you can only go so far inland and then the boats can't reach it to offload their catch. Hardened infrastructure is one of those things that's extremely important, but it's going to take a tremendous amount of investment. So taking docks and seafood processing plants and building them up into the air rather than just simply rebuilding the structure where it sits. Taking generator houses and building those out of concrete structures so that those generators can then be flipped on after a storm passes when the public utilities are out. One other really interesting thing, I think, is trying to encourage mobile operational capacity. And we see this sometimes actually in the bait industry. So a lot of our recreational fishermen like to use live bait. If those of you fish along the coast, you probably like to use live shrimp. Some of those bait shops have now gotten to where they have their water treatment facilities that goes into their bait tanks on mobile trailers, where when a storm is coming, they just unhook a few pipes, hook it up to the back of their truck, and they're out of there. And then when the storm is past, come back, clean out their bait tanks, plug it right back in. Hopefully they've got a generator. And so that's a small example, but if you build that up for larger capacity, I think that would work. And there's many, many others I'm sure you guys will come up with a lot better than those of us in the biological world. It's going to take an ingenuity of engineered solutions. And so I hope you all will work hard on that in the future and help our important fishing communities. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Purpose, or is there a theory for the purpose of becoming a dominantly male population when the water's too warm?
I don't think that there's a biological purpose at all. I think the animal has evolved over time to have a fairly even split of males and females. And so now with the rising water temperature, that cues more males, sort of like turtle eggs that are buried in the sand. I think that the farther down in the sand are more females. The top layer where it's warmer are more males. I just think that's the way that animal evolved. And now with the warmer temperatures, we're just seeing more males in that population, and it's causing some problems.
So are there any specific species in Louisiana that are endangered or expected to be extinct in the future because of climate change, any type of fish?
I don't think so at this time. I don't think we've quite gotten there yet, but certainly some of these trends are disturbing, like the flounder example. It's very, very worrisome, things like that. But you know, the patterns of ducks, for instance, have changed, and we don't see as many. They're not necessarily going extinct, but maybe locally in our area they are. So that may be a situation with flounder as well. And you may be in a situation where you have to go up the eastern seaboard into latitudes where maybe the difference in water temperature is not as extreme as it is down here. And so it could be a localized depletion issue.
So I want to go back to the engineered solutions, the last slide that you had. And since we've been talking about the infrastructure bill and we've been talking about the task force that's working on climate change, maybe there is room for getting some of these dollars to help with, for example, expanding the mobile, like the mobile bait shops that you were talking about, right? So are you part of the task force? Are you involved?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm part of any kind of task force, but we do work closely with the fishing community and fishing industry. They have an effort right now to try to grab some of that infrastructure money to help with some of these things, not just mobile operational capacity, but things like safe harbors, which helps build places that they can put their vessels behind some of CPRA's levees. And so, but rather than just pulling them inside of the floodgate and lining them up along the side of the bayou, actually build safe harbor docking space and things like that. So I do think there's some opportunities with that infrastructure money to try to hit some of these needs. There's no doubt about it. And so we're working on that with the industry.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, now for our final speaker for today, Ms. Colette Pichon Battle. Colette is a generational native of Bayou Liberty, Louisiana. As founder and co-executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, she develops programming focused on equitable disaster recovery, global migration, community economic development, climate justice, and energy democracy. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Well, if you laughed at the weather guy and the fish guy, this is really going to be a hoot. I'm the human rights girl. So I think I want to just say thank you to Momen and to all of you for even thinking that this should be a part of your conversation. It is often not a part of the climate conversation. It must be a part of the conversation. So thank you for being open to having me. Again, my name is Colette. I am from Slidell. Some of you know St. Tammany Parish. Since I'm in Louisiana, I'm rarely in Louisiana speaking. So I get to just tell folks where I'm from. I'm from the Bayou in St. Tammany Parish. And that is the traditional lands of the Choctaw people. The Choctaw people were the original people here. And in my human rights sector, we make sure that we acknowledge the land that we are on. So I live just north of the lake, across from New Orleans. And the land that I'm on is just right before you get to Mississippi. And I grew up in the Bayou. So loved the last presentation personally, but I love the fish. I love the things in the mud. I love the things that some people run away from. I think alligators are beautiful. I think we've got the best food ever in the history of the planet. And I think we've got something to be proud of. I'm really proud of my state. Every time I go somewhere, I brag on our funny accents, our good food, our best parties, but also the culture that really grounds us here. So my community has been here since before it was the United States. And so where I live has actually been a place for folks to dwell, indigenous folks, also free people of color, to dwell for a very long time. And I acknowledge the land that I come from, but I also want to acknowledge that the land that I'm speaking to you about will be lost to sea level rise in about the next 50, 60 years is the prediction. And this is a reality that I have to speak from every time I get on the microphone. No matter what we do, if we do the best we can do, my community will be lost. And so will millions of communities around the globe. And I think while we talk about this conversation of climate and climate crisis with statistics and data, which we need to do and we must do, the science is a part of this conversation. We have to remember that we're actually talking about human lives. We're talking about communities. We're talking about traditions being lost. We're talking about language being lost. We're talking about a lot of loss. And the question is not whether the thing is real. The question is, what are we going to do to stop the loss and to mitigate the damage? And so I'm excited to talk about some of the ways that the human rights movement, the climate justice movement is really talking about some of what we heard today and some of what you as students will be looking at over the next several years. I want to first mention disaster recovery because disaster is the reason I'm in this work in the first place. I began my career in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Before that, I was practicing corporate law in DC, and that was a life that I wanted to live. But when I came home to find that my community was completely destroyed, the question was, what do I do to help make sure this never happens again? And so in that 17 years now, it'll be 17 years in August, in that process, I've learned lots of things. First, as a lawyer, I've learned that the processes of disaster recovery are what I would call discriminatory. They're discriminatory not on their face, but they're discriminatory in what they produce. And I came to this conclusion after serving my community in the aftermath of all of those hurricanes we actually saw a map of. I was like, yes, I think I've done recovery for almost all of those. those hurricanes produce a lot of harm in communities. And those communities, in order to recover, they have to do a lot of paperwork. And I got to watch and help people do paperwork, but then also watch how the system provided for some, but didn't provide for others. The paperwork was the same. The agency that they went to were the same, but who was able to recover and why and when, those were the questions that began to step up for me. So I began to notice disparities in our laws. Our federal laws and even our state distribution were quite discriminatory. I don't think it was purposely done, but I do think it was done on top of a system that has been broken since the beginning. And as a person of color in this country, there has to be an acknowledgement of a legacy, of a history that we rarely like to talk about. And we don't have to talk about it too much here, but we do have to be honest about it. The legacy of slavery in this country and the way Black people and poor people are treated in this country shows itself in our laws and the way that people recover or don't in places and times of disaster. It's this reason that got me into thinking and understanding that policy change necessarily has to be part of this climate conversation. We have to change a lot of the laws and regulations that are at play, especially if we're going to get more and more storms and disasters and things that people rely on the government for. Our government has a chance to be something it has never been, which is a leader in human rights, a leader in human decency, a leader in protecting not just profit and property, but ecosystems and people. And so I love the question. Someone said, what was the, is there something that's going extinct in Louisiana? And I want to say, yes. The culture is going extinct. The people on the coast are, we're in danger. If we have to ask a question about which animals are going extinct, let me make sure that we remember to include the many humans, many of whom lost their lives in Hurricane Katrina, many who continue to live their lives and lose their lives in these storms, many who are having to leave their homes. I see we have some representatives from the governor's office. They will tell you, and so will the federal government, that the first dollars for relocation due to sea level rise were given to the state of Louisiana because of the state of what's happening on our coast and in our coastal communities. And this is serious because we now join not just a local conversation about the climate crisis, but a global one. My analysis around what's happening in the communities is not just watching what's happening in South Louisiana, it's talking to folks in Bangladesh, talking to folks in Vietnam, talking to folks in the Pacific Island nations who are already having to move whole cities because of sea level rise. This thing is real. It's real and it's here. And the solutions will have to be different if we want any kind of different reality than the one we have today. We often like to talk about adaptation. Adaptation in my neck of the woods means we're talking about how people just basically fight what's coming. What are you going to do right now and right here? Some people are going to raise their houses. Some people are going to relocate. Some people are going to stay and fight. But where are the rights that surround these things? Where's the help, as Sister asked earlier? Where are the dollars? And are the dollars getting to the people who need them the most? Where are these dollars going in this infrastructure bill, which I think I shocked a few of my friends when I said many climate justice advocates do not agree with this infrastructure bill, despite this being a Democrat president. This is nothing compared to what we need to combat this thing, and everybody knows it. And communities like mine are on the front line. So I cannot sit here and say that what we are seeing in policy is enough. It is nowhere near enough, and neither is our urgency around this issue and who gets the dollars, who gets the resiliency, and who gets to sure things up for what is coming. We're seeing relocation, we're seeing climate migration. St. Tammany Parish is already receiving people in from the lower parishes. We are going to see a clash. We already see clashes. We saw clashes after Katrina of what happens when different cultures, and yes, there are different cultures inside the state, when different cultures move into different places, it's tension. Some of my first cases were around racial discrimination. Bus drivers treating Katrina students terribly because they weren't used to Black children in their community. We still have to deal with these things. And if we think not dealing with them to focus on these new technologies is going to get us through the climate crisis, we are sorely mistaken. This is not just going to be about carbon out of the air. This is going to be about how you manage a whole population of people, most of whom have never considered the trauma they're in from having to move, or the trauma you're in from having to receive lots of folks in your community and you're not ready for it. This is much bigger than the science. This is much bigger than the statistics. And that's just adaptation. Let's talk about mitigation because this gets everybody all fired up. Usually gets me in a fight somewhere, but that's all right. I can solve it all at the bar with a glass of whiskey or a hot cup of tea because I see some of my other homies in here today. I just want to say we don't believe in this stuff. This new technology that's coming, let me tell you what it's going to do. It's going to come to communities like mine because toxic facilities are 80 times more likely to be near Black folks and 100 times more likely to be by poor people. And these new technologies that claim to get carbon out of the air are going to be experimented on people like me. Now, this wouldn't be a problem, except we have a history of experimenting on people like me and communities like mine. And this is the moment, if we want to take it, and maybe we're not courageous enough to yet, but this is the moment to actually say, we can do it different. We can actually make a system that advances human rights. We can actually make a system that advances the rights of nature. Why would we not do this? Well, profit is why we would not do this. Let's be clear and honest about it because we're just in one of those clear and honest moments. This is right now a conversation of whether or not we want to maintain an economic system that is built for a few, or whether we have the courage to change that system into a more global and more humane system that works for the many. And very few people in power want to have this discussion because to take away power from people with power means war. And we don't want war. We don't have to have war if we have enough courage to sit down and talk about things. What does it look like to have climate migration laws that are full of social policies that don't just calculate what the disaster did to the property? That's what we saw with some of these numbers. The numbers you see on these disasters is property damage. It's property damage. It is not cultural damage. It is not loss of life being calculated. It's property damage because our system only calculates loss based on property and profit. This is why we are in the situation we're in right now. It is not because our coasts aren't strong enough. They were strong. We have been investing in an industry that has been taking from this coast and from our people for generations. I am a daughter of oil and gas. I am a niece of oil and gas. There's nothing I can say here that should make you think I do not understand our relationship to oil and gas. We are that state, but we are at a new time. And even my community knows that there's a time to be accountable, not guilty, not saddled with guilt, but accountable. And when I say accountable, I ask the question, why are we giving billions of dollars to industries to do more experimenting on communities like mine when we can give that money to the front lines to prepare themselves for the storms that we know are coming and a new reality that we're all starting to admit is coming? Why don't we have the courage to do that? Because we don't want to balance out our society? Because we believe that there should be this big, deep inequity in our community that doesn't allow people to survive? Because we don't want people to have their choices? That's not what this country is about. This country is supposed to be about all the other things, which is why I think we have an opportunity. We're going to have to value the communities of South Louisiana and inland Louisiana, and the South Pacific, and Brazil, and Vietnam. We're gonna have to value them the same. And this usually scares the living lights out of people. What do you mean we have to value people the same? What do you mean your life is worth the same as mine? I mean just that. This is a moment that we will never get again because if we fail at this one, we are the ones who will go extinct. The fish, the birds, the alligators, and us. We go if we don't figure this out. This is not a new economic opportunity. This is a last chance. And it's not just a last chance for us to be urgent about. This is a chance for us to be imaginative, innovative, and brilliant about it. We could be our best human selves in this moment, or we can continue down this path that says we will take what we want and we will leave the rest to the side. My community and other communities are being left to the side. It is not fair, it is not just, it is not moral, and it is not right. And what we have right now, especially in the great state of Louisiana, is the ability to lead the entire world in new ways of thinking about how we address this problem. We don't have to put our money in profits. We don't have to put our investment in profit making. We don't have to put all of our eggs in the basket of new technologies. There's low-hanging fruit here. Here's a new one. Here's a novel one. We could consume less. We could actually consume less. One American consumes as much as 13 people in China. One American consumes as much energy as 127 people in Bangladesh. One American consumes as much as 307 people in Tanzania. We could consume less. We could actually consume less. But we don't want to consume less. We want to be comfortable. We want to be the comfortable, privileged people that we are. If you're in this room right now, you're comfortable and privileged, and that means me too. But it means we're going to have to ask ourselves a question. Is this about you or is this about us? And if this continues to be just about you, then let me tell you, the other forces that have said we have nothing to give except what we own ourselves, they have won. But if you think we can make a difference together, then it's time for us to start thinking about the easy fixes. We can retrofit buildings. We don't have to build new things. I like when the brother said it's not just the climate that's changing, we're changing on the ground too. In my neighborhood in St. Tammany Parish, they're clearing trees. They're clearing trees on the very land that's going to be taken by the water. The one thing we have to defend us against that water are the trees that drink it up. And we're taking the trees down to build more buildings, slab on grade, they're gonna flood. And let me tell you what they're doing with the subdivisions. They're honing in, they're finding Black people who are just starting their lives. And they're giving them 60-year mortgages, 30 years plus some other years on top of it. And they're saying, put all of your time and money into your house. But they didn't tell them that the flood maps of the CPRA show that neighborhood and all the rest of the neighborhoods going underwater in the next 50 years. They didn't tell them that part because we're still working on a system that wants to take from people. We're still looking at this as an opportunity to take from people and to profit. This is not that moment anymore. We've passed it. We've taken too much, and it's time for us to do something different. If we want to be really bold, we can engage with the global South. We can understand our role as a Southern state and its Southern people, and we can engage with what the global South has been calling for years. They want us to honor all indigenous treaties. Think about that, y'all. For those of you who are from this country, let me be clear. We have not honored the treaties of the original people. We have not honored what we said we were going to do. And then we point to them and call them vulnerable. We point to them and we say they can't figure things out. We point to them and we blame them for struggling in a new reality that they didn't help to create. Let's honor the treaties. This means give them their land back. This means give them their power back. We ready for that? I'm not sure we're ready, but I'm gonna just say it because that's the truth. We need to divest from all fossil fuels. Yep, I said it. I said it. Divest from all fossil fuels. We do not win without it. And as hard as it is to believe, that is the answer to the question. We do not win without a true divestment from fossil fuels, and at the very least, our public dollars should not be advancing fossil fuels in this country or in any other country. If we are saying this is the problem, why are we investing millions, no, billions of dollars in it for profits for a few? We have to address climate migration. It is happening already. This is not just about people moving across international borders. This is about people moving internally. And we will see this more and more as the climate continues to shift. And our reality is one that is changing in a way we can't even describe. Rain events, we don't even have names for this stuff anymore. We don't even know what these storms are called anymore. They're just coming and they're just dumping rain on us. And we've got to get ready. People are moving. People are moving temporarily. People are moving for the long term. My family left in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. They're still in Texas because that's what this does. If it takes out your whole community, it takes you to another place. We have to get ready for climate migration. And let me be clear, if we're not ready for climate migration in a state like Louisiana, we get race wars. We get tension. We get people blaming each other for things that are not their fault. We have to be honest about what our society is right now because this is what we're getting more of. If we're not ready for it, we have the ability to create receiving communities. We could get ready for this thing, but we're gonna have to acknowledge that it's happening. And we're gonna have to acknowledge that migration is a natural pattern and borders were created at tables of people, many of whom don't look like you and none of them look like me. I don't like talking about borders in America. Everybody gets very nervous about it. So I'll move from borders and just say, the other big thing we have to do is cancel all debt. Cancel all foreign debt. Do you know that some of these countries who could be preparing for climate reality are indebted to Western nations, most of whom colonized them? Now, we don't have to talk about the history of colonization and all of that, but here's what I'm going to say. If you're paying millions or billions of dollars a year to repay a debt that shouldn't be there in the first place, then you are absolutely not preparing for a new climate reality that is on the way if it has not hit you already. We want to cancel all of the debt, and we want federal laws that really advance accountability. The oil and gas industry knew this reality in the 1950s. They knew what was going to happen if they kept drilling, if they kept spewing, if they kept flaring. This is out in the open. I'm not even telling you a secret. They knew it since the 1950s. They even knew about the technology to take the carbon out of the air, but they said, we're not going to do it until the federal government pays it because it's too expensive. And that IIJA just did exactly what they predicted in the 50s. It is public dollars paying for technology that we shouldn't have needed in the first place. This is liability. This is what we need people to be accountable for. I don't need us to sit in blame or guilt, but we have to be clear. When folks are saying we don't have enough money to make the transition, we do. We can stop giving all tax breaks to oil and gas. We can make them pay for what they messed up. We can use those dollars to then put into what we need to go forward. But are we ready? We're not ready because we're so tied to profit and power. We will have nothing if we lose this planet. Not even our profit, not even our power. It's time to move past that. But this takes a level of humility that is not taught in this country, I'm afraid. It is taught in places like the bayous, but it's not taught in large institutions where people are seeking their degrees. There's a level of humility that is required for this moment, and I'm not sure we even know what that looks like. But it means that your individual self is not more important than my individual self. And it means that whatever you think you can do by yourself, we can do more together. And this is the new approach. It is not a competitive one. It is not American exceptionalism or American competition. It is global collectivism and community and family. And I know how soft it sounds. And I wouldn't be up here trying to convince you of it if I wasn't sure that it was true. So I say thank you for allowing me to bring this to you as a consideration of all of the other technological advances and the stats and the data that you're going to use. Remember this part. There are people's lives at stake. Our cultures are at stake. Our communities are at stake. And it's going to be up to all of you seeking these higher degrees, committed to this new level of work. It's going to be up to you to remember this part, because this is the part that is always invisibilized. Human rights have to be a part of this conversation. An ecosystem that supports all of us has to be part of this conversation. And people who have taken too much have to be accountable to a system that is now out of balance, to where our fish aren't turning the right sex because the water's too warm. This is a messing of God's creation, and we will have to answer for it. I think we can answer together. I think we can do it. And I thank you for hearing my words today.
I would just want to say thank you for your passion. That's inspiring. This is great, but can we look at it from a different perspective just for a second? Biden administration has been saying that we have to invest in creating equity in everything, right? So can you give us your idea of what steps should we be taking, action plans? How can people like us, if we're trying, for example, I'm very focused on working on initiatives that can enhance equity in transportation, for example. Can you give us some ideas of how you think we should go about that?
Yeah, I am not the transportation guru, but here's a thought. Yes, I think the Biden administration has said the word equity more than any other. I think lots of people are saying the word and have no idea what it means, and when it's time to implement it, have really no idea. But I think when it comes to transportation, one of the questions I've been getting, because I've been down in the lower parishes that the brother was speaking about earlier in the bayous, we've been talking about electric vehicles. You know, it's all the rage now, these electric vehicles. And you can't get these Bayou boys to be all right with these electric vehicles. As far as they're concerned, they don't want to get stuck somewhere. They don't, and it's true. I mean, the arguments are very rational. Will these things hold up in the life that we live out on the water, out on the docks? These are long days, long miles, whatever. It is amazing to me that as Americans, we're thinking about individual vehicles as opposed to thinking of mass transit, right? Because the fact that we're still thinking about individual vehicles and our own comfort and our own desire to be able to move ourselves around is exactly kind of the problem. We don't want to give anything up. We don't want to give up not 1 ounce of our comfort to advance this new vision. When I think about transportation equity, I think, how can the poorest, most targeted communities have access to the things they need? Which is not the same thing as saying, how do we get transit to downtown Baton Rouge so people can get to, the party? Or to the museum in New Orleans, to Canal Street. That's not who needs the transit. The transit is needed for the people who have to come work and sweep, and the janitors and the cooks. Who's getting the transit out to them, and how are we investing first in those folks? And then let the sort of leftovers be what we do for luxury. I think equity in transit is a huge thing, and I'm watching it bubble up a lot in Louisiana, about time, because the rest of the nation has been talking about it. But I think to advance it means we're going to have to prioritize the folks we like to forget about, which means we're going to be dealing with, they map these things out and they do a prediction on like rider fees and money. But what happens when you can't guarantee that money and you still guarantee people transportation? Why can't we think like that? Why can't we think out of the box from all of these squares that we're stuck in? We're supposed to be brilliant. Let's be brilliant and bold and courageous in the moment. So that's how I would answer transportation equity. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Don't worry, I'm very used to people disagreeing with me, just in case you're feeling it. I'm totally good with it.
First, I like to salute your courage. And I wish you were here earlier during this presentation, because while there is this worry about climate change and what is the future of the next generation coming, and we are looking into these innovative technologies about the electric vehicles. And so I asked a question that I would like to ask you. Why don't we look about regulating our consumptions? As you have mentioned, like other countries don't have this privilege of having, let's say, for example, for transportation, 4 or 5 cars per household. Right. And why does the low-income community and vulnerable population bear the effect of the consumption of higher of other peoples who have a higher
wealth?
Yeah, who are more privileged.
Yeah, I love your question. Thank you for seeing my courage. When I got the invitation to LSU, I was like, does Momin really know who he's inviting over here? But this is my state and I love it. I love it dearly. And I know so many of my colleagues do too. And so that's why I feel so passionate about it. I feel like I can be. Yeah, I give speeches around the world. And it is amazing to me how long it takes for Americans to even consider changing what we do. It's like, that's not even on the table, to consume less. What do you mean? How could we be so uncomfortable? Meanwhile, I just came back from West Africa where I was in a building a lot like this. It had no air conditioning. They just built the building in a way that the ocean breeze caught it and it was completely cooled. And there were no light switch because they built the windows in such a way that it was completely lit. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm in a West African nation and they figured this out. Why aren't all the buildings not LEED certified, but built to not use? Why aren't we thinking like that? It's because we don't have to. This is where I understand privilege. I know people talk about privilege in different ways, but this is where I understand privilege because I'm an American too. I'm a Black American, but I'm in that number of usage. And I know that if we are still to the point where we're not considering reducing consumption, it's because the climate crisis is not real yet for them. It's real for me. We lost everything. My family is completely displaced. I'm the only one who gets to be here because I don't need to go to the doctor or go to school. Do you know? There's a reality that I'm speaking from here that most people don't really know yet. And they don't have to know it because privilege keeps things away from you. Privilege means you don't have to look. You don't have to understand. You don't actually have to consider. That's the worst part of it. I think consumption reduction is what the answer is, but this is now talking about power and cultural change and social change. And that's too much to do in so little time. We must do something quicker. I get that all the time. And I have to tell people the urgency mindset was put on us. This is not something that we didn't know was happening and we didn't know where it comes from. This is something where we knew exactly where it was coming from. We knew exactly that it was going to happen. And now the urgency is ours to bear. And we have to, from the ground, even when it feels crazy, say, we cannot go fast. We're going to have to go really, really slow to make sure that equity is at the center of what we do. But if we do equity at the center of all of our actions and solutions, we leap. You don't step, you leap after that. But nobody really believes it. We've lost faith in our humanity. We've lost trust in what the other person's gonna do. And so, I struggle because I believe that we can make good decisions, but I'm not seeing us make good decisions. I'm seeing us move in fear, invest in the things we know, despite them being the things that got us here in the first place. And we're focusing on little things. So we hate each other individually instead of really starting to focus on things that make us understand that we're part of one human race. One. So I think consumption reduction is exactly what we need to do. It is not the most popular idea out there, I will tell you that. I have faced the critics on that one, but I think it's the solution. And I look forward to the day when people are courageous enough to admit that and face that. Thank you, sister, for that question. Wait.
Something that I might with the equity system, you said that.
So you mentioned that there is a lack in equity and the disaster recovery. So where is this lack of equity coming from? You said that someone may go for an agency and ask for some benefits, and another person will ask for the same benefits, and one will take it and another will not take it. So is it based on income or race? So where is the problem coming from in the current system?
Yeah, great question. The problem, one of the main problems, is that our federal disaster recovery law, and therefore the way the states distribute the money, is based on property loss and property damage. And in this country, we have a history that might not be known to all of you, but it is rooted in discrimination. So we had legal systems, systems that were widely practiced that made it difficult, if not impossible, for Black people in particular to live or get mortgages in certain areas. They called it redlining. If you look it up, it's a historic practice. But at the end, what it helped to create, especially as we were building out the middle class in places like St. Tammany, where I live, it made it hard for folks to get mortgages or houses if you were Black. It also, prior to the buildup of St. Tammany Parish in places like New Orleans in the lower 9th Ward that people heard about in Hurricane Katrina, and folks said, oh my gosh, those poor Black people, they weren't actually poor. The lower 9th Ward has the highest rate of home ownership in the city of New Orleans. They weren't poor, they were just Black. And why were they there? They were in the place they were, which was a low-lying area, very swampy. It got totally destroyed in Katrina because of discrimination and segregation, legal segregation, and social practices at banks around lending. So what we end up having, not just do we have people more on the front line of a storm, we actually have disaster formulas that say you may now receive the value of your property in your recovery. But the value of my property and the value of somebody else's property who is not a Black person are actually different depending on the neighborhoods we live in. So if we have the same square footage house, the same damage, but we live in communities where my house is worth less because I live in a Black neighborhood and your house is worth more because you don't, then the money that I get back from the federal government pays for half of my house to be refixed. Whereas if I lived in a white neighborhood, you got enough money to fix your whole house. This is based on market property, because what our federal government is looking for is property damage. And this is a discriminatory system, not because somebody hates Black people, but because our market housing system, to own a home and how it's rated, is still rooted in this discrimination that we never fixed. We never went back to deal with it. So now we're seeing storms and storms and storms on top of this, and you are literally seeing, and we had some very interesting lawsuits in New Orleans after Katrina around this. In, I forgot the name of the neighborhood, Lakeview, I believe it's called, in Lakeview versus New Orleans East, the same city. The houses look about the same, but one is a mostly white neighborhood and one is a mostly Black neighborhood, Black and Vietnamese, and they were getting less and they couldn't fix their homes. So this is, and the system was put down to the state. So the state had to distribute the dollars, had to make a program, had to do all of this. And so now you're dealing with federal policy and state regulations that end up being discriminatory just in how they play out. And that's just housing. And that's just assuming you had a house, because federal law says we're gonna tend to the homeowners first. But New Orleans was 65% renters. And in a lot of Black cities, we see a high rental rate. And then we have to get to banking laws and who has access to credit and all of this other stuff that I don't really know. I just see the impacts of, and I usually see them in a storm. So I haven't done like an assessment pre-storm. I just see what happens as people are filling out the same paperwork and with the results they're getting. We saw this in BP too, in the Deepwater Horizon explosion. We were legal counsel to many people in the St. Bernard, St. Tammany, lower parishes, and they had to fill out BP claims. This was a Deepwater Horizon explosion that happened 12 years ago. There was 190 million gallons of heavy crude oil spilled into the Gulf. There was a recovery process that you had to go through. And when people applied, they got denied. When we signed on to be their counsel without submitting any other paperwork other than they had counsel, we automatically received money that they got when they were denied applying on their own. And we were representing Black oystermen, poor rural fisher folk, Vietnamese folk. That's who we're representing. So these systems play out in a way. I'm not just making this stuff up. I've seen it with my own eyeballs. Like, it's really kind of crazy why people can't just recover. But the burden on the marginalized and targeted communities are what we're not taking attention to. And equity says we will understand the history that got us here. We will address the inequities that exist, and we will make a solution that pulls us all the way forward. That's why you get that leap. It's not an incremental step like regular policy change. We're talking about grand leaps in our society. And there's been no other time in history that we've seen this ability to leap, except in these moments where we're facing our own mortality. And that's what's happening right now. Thank you, Momen, for the question. Thank you. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Colette. That concludes the presentation section of our seminar today.
I think, before we conclude this presentation, I think there is a question from one of the online participants, and it's for all of the attendees, because I think one good thing about this summit that we discussed climate change from different perspectives. So the question is to all the presenters: what are your opinions to reduce the impact of climate change in general?
So shall we go around and do like a minute each? And I can start with.
Okay, just so I'm clear, what was the question?
How do you think we can mitigate or reduce the impact of climate change?
My opinion is that, I see even on slides occasionally phrases like control climate change. That's absurd. We can't control it. I mean, first of all, there's a climate change that's a natural variability that has nothing to do with humans. And I think that what we can do, and I think if you look at history, humans have been pretty resilient in terms of being able to develop the technologies to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I think that's probably the approach we need to take. I'm very sympathetic to the position of our last speaker, but I also think that, to be honest with you, I'm not ready to go back to stone knives and bear skins. So to say that you want to divest from fossil fuels is, I'm not sure that's especially realistic, at least not in the next 50 years. And the fact that, and Dr. Delia made this point that I've been behind for a long time, while the United States does have the money, the technology, the skill to reduce our consumption, you're not going to get other countries to agree to that are just now reaching a level of comfort that they've been missing for decades or more. So you already see that, for example, China produces more CO2 than the United States. India will bypass us within the next decade, maybe even within the next 5 years. Now, understandably, these are population centers for the globe. And yes, we could certainly reduce consumption per individual, but I think a more rational approach, and this is focusing mainly on Louisiana, is mitigative strategies that will limit the impacts, and at some point also recognize that there are some aspects that we cannot control. Sea level rise is not something we're going to put the brakes on anytime soon. So the coast needs to, the approach to the coastal solution needs to incorporate that. And with CPRA's work, they're doing incredible things down there in terms of recreating land. But we also see that a single storm can wipe out 2 or 3 years worth of effort. There's a point at which we're simply not going to be able to solve all the problems. And we also need to remember that our image of the earth is the image that we create. Mother Nature is fine and capable of handling all the crap we throw at it. But what we want may not necessarily be what the natural processes are going to allow.
I would just say we can't focus on one thing. It needs to be all of the things, all parts of society, all parts of our economy at the same time, moving them all forward at the same time to get us to net zero by 2050, or to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, which is, I think, where there's an incredible amount of opportunity for you to follow your own passion, to follow what, figure out what part of the puzzle what piece of the puzzle you want to be, and plug in, and you don't have to do all of them, just find your area and work passionately and hard. And, whether it's transportation or invertebrate species, Patrick, whatever you're into, they all play a role.
Well, I think I talked about some of the things we can do in my presentation for the fishing community, and I don't know that I would try to go outside of that. But in the fishing community, it's going to be very, very difficult, because it's going to take a lot, as with all of the other sections of society, it's going to take a lot of investment, a lot of money, and a lot of time. I mean, all the way down to retrofitting vessels with more environmentally friendly engines and things like that. I mean, that seems small compared to the presentation we just heard. We heard a lot of these big picture things, but down to the actual fisherman, and what can we do to help that fisherman reduce their footprint, reduce their emissions, and then multiply it by a gazillion.
And I totally agree with that. Actually, I think that's exactly where we should start. I think we should start with the fisher folk. I think we should start with the workers. I think that's exactly how we win this. this thing. And I think the most irrational part of this conversation is thinking we can do what we're doing and we're not going to get in a worse situation. My suggestion around divesting in fossil fuels is because we have to transition our energy system and we have to start. And if we keep talking about what can't happen, then we'll never start. And the courage that we need right now is to take one step, one vessel, one plant. Yes, individuals change is what we need to see, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about all of the billions of dollars we see invested into an industry that is harming us. We could be investing in renewables. I actually applaud the governor for his stance on wind energy and what's been going. Like, let's talk about that. I will fight about many things inside of wind energy, but let's at least fight going in the right direction. We should be moving, we should be transitioning, and we should start with the workers. That is the right step. And the most irrational thing that we could do is to think we've got time to figure it all out or to argue about it. We do not. I agree, Harry. We have to do everything, everybody. We got to have all the arguments and all the conversations. And then we have to have the courage to move on this instead of talking about what we can't do. We have to believe in the greatest part of our humanity, which is all of those great accomplishments we've had in the past. It's time for some more. It's time for another one. And we really, really don't have any time to waste.
Well, thank you all. I think with that, we conclude the seminar part, at least, or the presentation part of the seminar. And we hope to stay in touch and we'll learn. And if you want to learn more about the Tran-SET group, which I think you all already know, Momin and Hassan are in the room, you can ask them questions. And we hope to stay in touch with our speakers and hopefully build more collaboration going forward. Thank you so much.
Guys, so for students, we are having a competition for the internship. So who is excited about that? Okay.